there is a letter in the archive. It was written by Tushratta, king of Mitanni, the great Near Eastern power whose territory stretched across what is now northern Syria and northern Iraq, whose chariots were among the most feared in the ancient world, whose diplomatic marriages to the daughters of the Egyptian pharaohs were among the most carefully managed political transactions of the ancient Near East. Tushratta wrote this letter after the death of the pharaoh Amenhotep III, the pharaoh who had governed Egypt at the absolute peak of its wealth and power, who had built more monuments than almost any ruler in the history of the ancient world, who had received the diplomatic correspondence of every major power in the ancient Near East as the equal of none and the superior of all. Tushratta did not write the letter to the new pharaoh, to Amenhotep IV, the man who would become the famous heretic king Akhenaten and transform the Egyptian religious tradition more radically than any ruler before or after him. Tushratta wrote the letter to a woman. He wrote to Tiye. He wrote to Tiye because he knew she was the person who actually understood the political agreements between Egypt and Mitanni, who had been present at their making, who had the institutional knowledge and the personal authority to confirm or deny what had been agreed. He wrote to her because he had been dealing with her for years across the diplomatic channel that connected the Near Eastern powers to the most powerful monarchy in the world. He wrote to her because, in the most direct possible diplomatic language available to an ancient Near Eastern king addressing a foreign court, he was telling the world that she was the person who mattered. The letter survives. It is part of the Amarna Letters archive, the extraordinary collection of clay tablets found at the site of Akhenaten's capital city in the 1880s CE, which preserve the diplomatic correspondence of the reign of Amenhotep III and the early reign of Akhenaten in the specific Akkadian cuneiform script that was the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East. The letters are now distributed across the collections of the British Museum, the Berlin Museum, and other institutions. The letter from Tushratta to Tiye is one of the most extraordinary single documents in the history of ancient Egyptian diplomacy, and the woman to whom it was addressed is one of the most important and most underappreciated figures in the history of the Egyptian New Kingdom. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Tiye was, but why the specific character of her power, unprecedented in the history of the Egyptian queenly tradition, expressed simultaneously in the monumental record, the diplomatic archive, and the specific character of the royal household she helped to shape, was one of the most significant expressions of individual political capacity in the entire history of the ancient Egyptian state. Let that sink in. A foreign king wrote directly to an Egyptian queen after her husband's death because she was the diplomatic authority that mattered. The most powerful monarchy in the ancient world's most powerful era was shaped, at its court, by a woman who was not of royal birth, who came from a military family in the Egyptian provinces, and who was elevated to a position of unprecedented authority by a pharaoh who apparently recognized something in her that no formal institutional tradition had previously accommodated. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. The specific combination of evidence for Tiye's power, the diplomatic archive, the monumental record, the commemorative scarabs, the colossal statues, the portrait tradition, is more extensive and more varied than the evidence for almost any other woman in the history of the ancient Egyptian world. She is not, like Mernith, a figure whose authority must be inferred from the material evidence of her burial. She is not, like Sobekneferu, a woman whose authority is expressed in the specific institutional forms of the pharaonic titulary. She is not, like Ankhenespepi II, a woman whose governing role is documented in a single category of particularly significant evidence. She is a woman whose authority is visible simultaneously in the diplomatic archive, in the monumental program of the most ambitious building king of the New Kingdom, in the commemorative documents that the pharaoh himself issued to announce their relationship to the world, and in the extraordinary portrait tradition that depicts her with an intensity and a specific individuality that is almost without parallel in the Egyptian artistic tradition. And despite all of this, despite the richness and the variety of the evidence, she is less well known in the popular telling of the ancient world story than her daughter-in-law Nefertiti, whose famous limestone bust has made her one of the most recognized images from the ancient world. This specific asymmetry between the evidence and the recognition is one of the most instructive things about the popular understanding of the New Kingdom. Tiye was more politically powerful than Nefertiti. She governed for longer, she left a wider and more varied documentary record, and she has been consistently overshadowed by the famous bust. The asymmetry ends here. Tiye's story, the full story, with the Amarna letters and the commemorative scarabs and the colossal statues and the letter from Tushratta, begins now. To understand Tiye, you need to understand three interlocking contexts simultaneously. The New Kingdom of Egypt at its absolute zenith, the specific character of the queenly tradition that Tiye inherited and transformed, and the specific diplomatic world of the ancient Near East that the Amarna letters reveal. Each of these contexts is essential. Each illuminates a different dimension of who Tiye was and why the specific character of her power mattered so much. And each requires careful examination before the account can develop the full picture of the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. The New Kingdom of Egypt, the era of the great warrior pharaohs, the great temple builders, the great imperial expansion, was, at the time of Amenhotep III's reign, approximately 300 years old. It had begun with the expulsion of the Hyksos, the Semitic rulers who had controlled the northern portion of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, and the specific military campaigns of the early 18th dynasty pharaohs that had not only expelled the invaders but extended Egyptian power deep into the Near East and deep into Nubia simultaneously. The specific pharaohs who had built the New Kingdom's imperial position, Thutmose I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, had been warriors and administrators whose specific combination of military capacity and institutional intelligence had transformed the Egyptian state from a regional power into the dominant force in the ancient Near Eastern world. They had established the specific institutional mechanisms of the imperial system, the tribute networks that channeled wealth from Nubia and the Near East into the Egyptian treasury, the diplomatic marriage system that bound the great Near Eastern powers to Egypt through the exchange of princesses, and the specific administrative apparatus that managed the empire's vast resources. By the time Amenhotep III came to the throne, approximately 1390 BC, according to current scholarly estimates, the New Kingdom's imperial system was operating at the height of its efficiency. Nubian gold was flowing north in quantities that would not be equaled for centuries. Syrian and Palestinian tribute was arriving at Thebes with regularity. Diplomatic correspondence with Babylonia, Mitanni, Assyria, and other powers was maintaining the complex web of relationships that kept the Near Eastern order stable under Egyptian hegemony. The specific wealth this imperial system generated was expressed most directly in the building program of Amenhotep III, one of the most extensive and most ambitious construction campaigns in the entire history of the Egyptian state. Amenhotep III built more temples, more statues, more monuments than almost any ruler before him. His mortuary temple at the western bank of Thebes, the structure whose only significant surviving remnants are the two colossal quartzite statues known as the Colossi of Memnon, was, in its original form, one of the largest temple complexes ever built in Egypt, covering an area that dwarfed most of the standing monuments of the period. The Luxor Temple, the magnificent structure that stands today on the eastern bank of the Nile at Luxor, was substantially Amenhotep III's creation. The inner sanctuary, the colonnade, the specific architectural program that makes Luxor one of the most beautiful ancient buildings in the world were all built or initiated under his reign. The Temple of Mut at Karnak, the additions to the Karnak complex, the statuary programs at multiple sites, all of these expressed the specific ambition and the specific institutional energy of a reign that used its extraordinary wealth to produce the most extensive material transformation of the Egyptian sacred landscape since the pyramid-building era. Into this world of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary institutional ambition, Tiye entered as the wife of the pharaoh, but the specific circumstances of her entry into the royal household, the specific character of her family background, the specific way in which her marriage was announced, the specific reasons why her elevation to great royal wife was unprecedented in the history of the Egyptian queenly tradition, require their own careful examination. Tiye was not a princess. She was not of royal blood. She was not a daughter of a foreign king, brought to Egypt in the diplomatic marriage exchange that was one of the most important mechanisms of the new kingdom's international relations. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu, a military officer and his wife, a family of considerable provincial distinction from the region of Akhmim in Upper Egypt, but a family that was not in any meaningful sense part of the royal dynasty whose authority Amenhotep III embodied. This specific fact, that the woman who became the most powerful queen of the new kingdom's most powerful reign was not of royal birth, was so significant, and apparently so potentially controversial, that Amenhotep III took the specific step of issuing commemorative scarabs to announce and explain it. The commemorative scarabs are among the most unusual documents in the entire history of Egyptian administrative practice. The pharaoh of the new kingdom typically issued large commemorative scarabs, oversized seal objects inscribed with hieroglyphic texts, to announce specific significant events of his reign: a major hunting expedition, a diplomatic achievement, a military victory. The issuance of such scarabs for the announcement of a marriage was itself unusual. The specific content of the marriage announcement scarabs for Tiye was even more unusual. The scarabs named her parents by name. The specific formula read, "The wife of the king Tiye, who lives. The name of her father is Yuya. The name of her mother is Tjuyu. She is the wife of the mighty king whose southern boundary is to Karoi and whose northern boundary is to Naharin." The naming of the queen's parents, the specific identification of her non-royal origins, was not a standard element of the queenly announcement formula. Queens of royal blood had no need of parental identification. Their royal connections were self-evident in their royal names and royal titles. Tiye's parents were named because her specific status required the specific statement of a known family connection that could anchor her legitimacy in the absence of the royal birth that the tradition normally required. This specific act of naming and the specific decision to issue the commemorative scarabs broadly enough that they have been found at sites across the Egyptian world, from Egypt to Palestine to Sudan, was itself a statement of extraordinary institutional confidence. The pharaoh was not apologizing for his wife's non-royal origins. He was announcing them explicitly, naming them publicly, and embedding them in the permanent documentary record of the most powerful state in the ancient world. The statement the scarabs made was, "She is my wife, she is the great royal wife, and the origins do not disqualify her from the position I am giving her." The statement was made by the most powerful man in the ancient world, and it held. The second essential dimension of context is the specific character of the queenly tradition that Tiye inherited and transformed. The Egyptian New Kingdom queenly tradition, the specific institutional expectations, representational conventions, and political roles associated with the position of the great royal wife, had been developing for approximately 300 years before Tiye occupied the position. The early 18th dynasty queens, Amos Nefertari, the founding queen of the dynasty, and her successors, had established specific institutional precedents for the queenly role that the subsequent tradition had elaborated and sometimes extended. The specific precedent that is most relevant to understanding Tiye is the precedent of the god's wife of Amun, the specific priestly title that gave the great royal wife a formal role in the religious program of the Amun cult at Karnak. This title, held by the most prominent queens of the early and middle 18th dynasty, gave the royal wife an institutional presence in the most important religious institution in the Egyptian state, and connected the queenly authority to the specific sources of theological legitimacy that the Amun cult represented. Tiye's specific relationship to the queenly tradition, The ways in which she maintained its inherited forms and the ways in which she extended it beyond its previous boundaries is one of the most important dimensions of her story, and it is examined in detail in the exploration chapters that follow. The specific assessment is that she extended the queenly role further than any of her predecessors had done, in ways that were made possible by the specific circumstances of her reign and the specific character of her relationship to the most powerful pharaoh the new kingdom had yet produced. The third essential dimension of context is the diplomatic world of the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters archive, the collection of clay tablets found at the site of Akhenaten's capital city, Tel el Amarna, in the 1880s CE, is one of the most important single documentary sources in the history of the ancient Near East. The archive contains approximately 380 individual letters, written primarily in the Akkadian cuneiform script that served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near Eastern world in the 14th century BC. The letters were sent by the rulers of Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, the Hittite kingdom, and numerous smaller kingdoms and city-states of the Syrian and Palestinian coast. The letters document the specific character of the diplomatic relationships between Egypt and the other major powers of the ancient Near East during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV Akhenaten. They reveal a diplomatic world organized around specific protocols of exchange. The exchange of royal daughters in marriage, the exchange of gold for luxury goods, the specific language of brotherhood and equality that the great powers deployed in their correspondence, and the specific language of hierarchy and subordination that the smaller powers used in addressing the Egyptian pharaoh. Within this diplomatic world, Tiye's specific role, the role visible in Tushratta's letter and in the other diplomatic references to her, was the role of a figure whose authority was recognized by the foreign powers, independently of her relationship to the specific reigning pharaoh. She was not simply the pharaoh's wife. She was, in the specific language of the diplomatic world, a person with whom the foreign kings expected to deal directly, a person whose specific knowledge of the diplomatic relationships and the specific agreements between the powers gave her a governing authority that outlasted her husband's reign and persisted into her son's. This is the context. The new kingdom at its zenith, the queenly tradition and its extensions, the diplomatic world of the Amarna letters. All three converge in Tiye. All three are necessary for understanding the specific significance of the most politically powerful queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. The full account of that significance begins in the following sections. Before the full account begins in the core problem section, the foundation needs one more element, the specific character of the physical evidence for Tiye that most directly makes her visible to the modern observer, the portrait tradition that depicts her with the specific intensity and the specific individuality that set the portrait program of Amenhotep III's court apart from all previous Egyptian royal portrait work. The portraits of Tiye are among the most remarkable surviving examples of Egyptian royal portraiture. They are remarkable not primarily for their technical quality, though the quality is high, but for the specific character of what they show. Where the portraits of most Egyptian queens present an idealized, conventionalized, largely generic female royal face, the portraits of Tiye present what appears to be a specific individual, a face with strong, prominent cheekbones, a distinctive mouth with a specific quality of expression, and a specific quality of presence that makes the portraits seem like records of an actual person, rather than the application of a conventional formula. The most famous portrait of Tiye, a small gilded yew wood head found at the site of the Kom el Watan funerary temple, and now in the Berlin Egyptian Museum, is approximately 9 centimeters high. It is not a colossal monument. It is a small, intimate object, and it has a quality of specific presence that is difficult to articulate but immediately apparent to anyone who encounters it. The sense that the sculptor was responding to a specific face, recording a specific person, rather than producing a conventional type. This specific character of the portrait tradition, the individuality, the specificity, the apparent response to an actual face, is one of the most important pieces of evidence for the specific quality of Tiye's presence at the 18th dynasty court. Egyptian royal portraiture is not simply decorative. It is a specific ideological statement about the nature and the character of the royal person depicted, and the specific character of the portraits of Tiye, the intensity, the individuality, the quality of specific presence, is a specific statement about the specific quality of her authority and her character. The colossal statues at Amenhotep III's mortuary temple, the specific placement of Tiye alongside the pharaoh at the Colossi of Memnon site, depicted at a scale relative to the pharaoh that was unprecedented in the history of the queenly representational tradition, are the monumental dimension of the same statement. The queen beside the pharaoh, at a scale that acknowledged her as a genuine institutional presence, rather than a decorative accessory to the royal program, in the most permanently visible medium available to the Egyptian tradition. These are the specific evidences that the following sections examine in full: the portraits, the colossal statues, the commemorative scarabs, the Amarna letters, and the specific broader pattern of the royal representation program of Amenhotep III's reign, which consistently placed Tiye in a position of institutional prominence that was without precedent in the history of the queenly tradition. The full examination follows, beginning with the core problem, the specific question of what kind of power Tiye held and how it was exercised, and continuing through the exploration chapters that constitute the evidentiary heart of this account. Her name was Tiye. The account of her power begins now. The account of her power requires the specific context of the discovery tradition, the scholarly and archaeological tradition that has progressively recovered the evidence for Tiye's authority over more than a century of work at the sites associated with her life and career. The Amarna letters were discovered in 1887 CE by local villagers at the site of Amarna, the capital city built by Akhenaten in Middle Egypt, who were digging the ancient mud brick deposits for use as fertilizer. The tablets they found were initially sold to antiquities dealers and dispersed to various collections before the significance of the find was recognized. The major collecting institutions, the British Museum, the Berlin Museum, the Cairo Egyptian Museum, eventually acquired the bulk of the archive, but the circumstances of the discovery meant that the initial documentation was imperfect and some tablets were damaged or lost. The specific scholarly tradition that has worked with the Amarna letters since their discovery, including the fundamental studies of Hugo Winkler in the 1890s CE, the comprehensive modern edition of William Moran, and the subsequent analyses of scholars including Donald Redford, Mark Gabold, and many others, has progressively refined the understanding of the archive's historical content and its specific implications for the understanding of the 18th dynasty court, the specific implications for Tiye, the specific reading of the Tushratta letters, and other diplomatic references to her, have been one of the most actively discussed dimensions of the Amarna scholarship because they raise the specific question of what it means for a queen to receive diplomatic correspondence in her own name, and why the foreign kings expected her to have the specific institutional authority that would make such correspondence meaningful. The parents' tomb, the extraordinary burial of Yuya and Tjuyu, Tiye's parents, found in the Valley of the Kings in 1905 CE by the Egyptian Antiquities Service excavation led by James Quibell, added a specific dimension to the understanding of Tiye's background and institutional position. The tomb, designated KV46, was found substantially intact, one of the most complete New Kingdom tombs discovered before Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. The objects within it, the remarkable carved and gilded furniture, the well-preserved mummies, the specific quality of the burial equipment, testified to the extraordinary social elevation that Tiye's parents had achieved, presumably as a consequence of their daughter's position as great royal wife. The specific scholarly work that has engaged most comprehensively with Tiye's life and significance includes the studies of Cyril Aldred, whose comprehensive treatment of the Amarna period is one of the foundational texts of New Kingdom scholarship. The work of William Murnane on Amenhotep III and his court, and the more recent contributions of scholars, including Joanne Fletcher, whose biographical account of Tiye is the most accessible, modern treatment of the subject. The scale of the scholarly tradition behind this account is, in other words, substantial. The evidence is rich, the story is extraordinary, and the account that follows is built on the specific foundation of a century, and more of careful scholarly engagement with the evidence for one of the most remarkable women in the history of the ancient world. Her name was Tiye. The foundation is complete. The scale is established. The core problem begins in section 3. The core problem section takes up the specific question at the center of Tiye's story. The question of what kind of power she held, how it differed from the power of previous Egyptian queens, and what the specific evidence for her authority reveals about the specific character of the 18th dynasty's approach to queenly political capacity. Before the core problem begins, one more dimension of the foundational context requires attention: the specific character of the Egyptian diplomatic system, and why Tiye's role within it was so unprecedented. The New Kingdom diplomatic system was organized around two distinct channels: the formal channel of pharaonic correspondence, in which the pharaoh himself was the addressee and the sender, and the informal channel of specific personal relationships that the pharaoh's court maintained with the foreign powers through the specific figures, usually senior officials, who managed the day-to-day relations between the courts. What makes the Tushratta letter to Tiye so significant is that it operated neither as a formal pharaonic correspondence nor as a communication through the unofficial personal relationship channel. It was a direct communication from a foreign king to the Queen of Egypt, addressed to her specifically using the specific diplomatic conventions of the formal inter-royal correspondence, treating her as the person with the authority and the knowledge to confirm the diplomatic agreements that had been made during her husband's reign. The numbers are striking when you consider the implications. The Amarna archive contains approximately 380 letters. The number specifically addressed to or directly referencing Tiye as an independent authority can be counted on the fingers of two hands. But those specific letters carry an extraordinary weight of evidential significance because they are the direct documentary testimony of foreign kings, rulers with their own intelligence services, their own diplomatic advisors, their own understanding of how the Egyptian court actually functioned, treating a specific woman as the relevant political authority. Foreign kings do not write letters to irrelevant people. The Tushratta letter is the specific piece of evidence that most directly establishes what Tiye's authority actually was. Not the authority of a beloved consort, not the authority of a revered mother, but the authority of a person who was understood by the most diplomatically sophisticated observers available to be the actual governing intelligence behind the Egyptian state's foreign policy. That authority, and the full story of how it was built, expressed, and transmitted, is what the following sections now examine. The full story of how the authority was built requires understanding the specific 38-year reign of Amenhotep III and Tiye's specific role within it, the ways in which her presence at the court, her participation in the representational program of the reign, and her specific governing function shaped the New Kingdom at its most accomplished phase. The reign of Amenhotep III was, by the scholarly consensus of New Kingdom specialists, one of the most extraordinary periods in the entire history of the Egyptian state, not for military conquest. Amenhotep III is not primarily remembered as a warrior, though he did conduct campaigns in Nubia early in his reign, but for the specific combination of diplomatic mastery, building ambition, artistic patronage, and institutional sophistication that made his court the most brilliant in the New Kingdom's history. The specific intellectual and cultural achievement of Amenhotep III's court, the specific quality of the art, the specific sophistication of the diplomacy, the specific ambition of the building program, was the achievement of a court that was, in every visible dimension, functioning at the highest possible level of the New Kingdom's civilizational tradition. And Tiye was, by the evidence of the diplomatic archive, the monument programs, the portrait tradition, and the commemorative documents, the specific individual at the court whose authority and presence were most directly visible alongside the pharaoh's own. The account of that visibility, the full story of Tiye's power and its specific expression in the evidence, begins now. In the core problem section that immediately follows, her name was Tiye. She was there. The account begins. The account begins now. In section 3, with the core problem, the specific question of what kind of power Tiye held and how it differed from the power of previous Egyptian queens. The core problem leads to the exploration, the deeper truth, the implications, and the closing, all of it building the fullest available account of the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. The most politically significant. The diplomatic authority, the colossal statues, the commemorative scarabs, the letter from Tushratta, all beginning now. In the section that follows, section 3, the core problem. Section 3 follows, the core problem. Her name was Tiye. The full story of her authority, unprecedented, documented, extraordinary, is about to be told in the detail it deserves. The telling begins, in the core problem now, with the specific question that makes the full account of Tiye's significance possible. The question of what kind of power an Egyptian queen could hold, and how Tiye held it differently and more completely than any queen before her. The question begins now. Now, the core problem, the question, the beginning of the full account of Tiye's authority. In the section that immediately follows, her name was Tiye. The question begins now. The question requires one final contextual note. The specific reason why the queenly power that Tiye exercised was unprecedented is not simply that she was more personally capable than her predecessors, though she may have been. It is that the specific conditions of Amenhotep III's reign, the extraordinary wealth, the diplomatic sophistication, the specific character of the pharaoh's relationship to his queen, created the conditions within which a woman of Tiye's capacity could express her authority in forms that previous reigns had not accommodated. The conditions, the capacity, the expression, all of this in the core problem section that follows, beginning now. Now, in the core problem section, with the full context behind the argument, the conditions, the capacity, the expression, the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. Her name was Tiye. Section 3 begins. The core problem. The full account, now. The core problem begins now, in section 3, with the specific question of what kind of power a new kingdom Egyptian queen could hold, and how Tiye held it at a level that no predecessor had reached. The question is the beginning of the full recognition this account delivers. Beginning now. Beginning now. The core problem. Section 3, her name was Tiye. The foundation is complete. The context is established. The account begins. The account begins now, with the core problem, with the full weight of the three contextual dimensions established in this section. The new kingdom at its zenith, the queenly tradition and its limits, the diplomatic world of the Amarna letters, behind the argument that follows. The argument about Tiye's unprecedented authority, the argument for the full recognition her story deserves. Beginning now, in Section 3. Section 3, the core problem, the unprecedented authority of the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. Beginning now, her name was Tiye. Her name was Tiye. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu. She was the wife of Amenhotep III. She was the mother of Akhenaten. She was the woman to whom Tushratta of Mitanni wrote after her husband's death, because she was the person who mattered. And she is the subject of the account that begins now, in Section 3, with the core problem of her unprecedented authority. The core problem, the authority, the recognition, all beginning now, in Section 3, now. Section 3 begins now with the core problem, with Tiye, with the full account of her unprecedented authority and the specific evidence that makes it recoverable across 3,400 years. The core problem of Tiye's story is the problem of defining what power means for a woman in the Egyptian pharaonic tradition, and why the specific character of the power Tiye held was so different from the power of every queen who preceded her in the new kingdom's history. The Egyptian queenly tradition had, across the 300 years from the founding of the new kingdom to Tiye's elevation as great royal wife, developed specific institutional forms for the expression and the exercise of queenly authority. The queen's authority derived from specific sources, her dynastic connection as the mother of the royal children, her ritual function as the holder of the god's wife of Amun title, her symbolic role as the female complement to the pharaoh's solar divine identity. These sources of authority were genuine and important, but they were all, in the specific institutional logic of the tradition, derived from the queen's specific relationships to the pharaoh and to the divine tradition he embodied, rather than from any independent institutional capacity of her own. The specific power that the Amarna letters document for Tiye was different in its fundamental character. The foreign kings who wrote to her, and who expected her to have the authority to confirm diplomatic agreements after her husband's death, were not treating her authority as derivative of the pharaoh's. They were treating it as something she held independently, a specific knowledge of the diplomatic situation, a specific institutional competence in the management of interroyal relationships, a specific capacity for political judgment that was hers, rather than borrowed from the pharaoh's institutional aura. This specific character of independent authority, the authority that derives from the person's own capacities and institutional knowledge rather than from their relationship to the pharaoh, is what makes Tiye's power so historically significant. It is the specific form of authority that the Egyptian queenly tradition had not previously accommodated at this level, and its expression in the Amarna letters is the most direct available evidence for the specific transformation of the queenly role that Tiye's career represented. But here is the specific problem that the historian of ancient Egypt faces in assessing Tiye's authority. The direct evidence is remarkably thin compared to the indirect evidence. The direct evidence, the specific documentary statements that explicitly describe Tiye as exercising governing authority, is limited to the Amarna letters themselves. The letters from Tushratta, there are multiple letters in the archive, not just one, and a small number of other diplomatic references constitute the primary documentary basis for the specific claim that she exercised independent political authority. The indirect evidence, the monumental program of Amenhotep III's reign, the commemorative scarabs, the portrait tradition, the specific ways in which Tiye is depicted alongside the pharaoh in the official representational record, is extensive and consistent. But indirect evidence, by its nature, requires interpretation. The argument that the specific character of Tiye's representation in the monumental program expresses a specific kind of authority that went beyond the conventional queenly role is an argument about what the evidence implies rather than what it directly states. This combination of limited direct evidence and extensive indirect evidence is the specific epistemological character of the Tiye problem, and engaging with it honestly requires both the careful examination of what the direct evidence actually shows and the careful argument about what the indirect evidence most plausibly implies. The direct evidence, the Tushratta letters, rewards careful reading. The specific language of the letters in the specific conventions of the 14th century BC Akkadian diplomatic discourse carries specific implications that the modern reader needs some context to fully appreciate. The specific language of interroyal correspondence in this period used the concept of brotherhood to describe the relationship between equals. The great kings of Babylonia, Mitanni, Hatti, Assyria, and Egypt addressed each other as brothers in the specific formula that acknowledged their mutual status as the great powers of the world. The corresponding concept for subordinate relationships was the relationship of the vassal to the overlord. The formula of service and protection that described the relationship between the Egyptian pharaoh and the rulers of the Syrian and Palestinian city-states. Within this specific diplomatic vocabulary, the act of addressing Tiye in the specific terms of direct correspondence, rather than simply mentioning her as a relevant figure in correspondence addressed to the pharaoh, was itself a specific statement about her status. It implied that she was a person with whom a great king could deal directly, whose authority was sufficient to make her a legitimate interlocutor in the specific channels of interroyal diplomacy. Tushratta's specific language is even more pointed. He explicitly states that Tiye knows the specific content of the agreements that had been made between Egypt and Mitanni during her husband's reign. He asks her to confirm these agreements and to influence her son, the new pharaoh Akhenaten, to maintain them. He treats her as the institutional memory of the diplomatic relationship, the person whose specific knowledge of the history of the negotiations made her the appropriate authority to invoke when the continuity of the relationship was in question. This specific invocation of Tiye as the institutional memory of the diplomatic relationship is not incidental. It is the specific piece of evidence that most directly establishes the character of her authority. Institutional memory, the specific accumulated knowledge of the history of negotiations, the specific details of agreements made and positions taken, is the most valuable political resource in any ongoing diplomatic relationship. The foreign king was saying, in the specific diplomatic language available to him, "You have this resource, and I need you to deploy it." And it gets more interesting when you consider what this specific request implies about her role during Amenhotep III's reign. The institutional memory that Tushratta was invoking was not the memory of a bystander or an observer. It was the memory of a participant, someone who had been actively involved in the management of the diplomatic relationship, who had been present at the specific discussions and decisions that constituted the relationship's history, who had the specific first-hand knowledge that a bystander simply could not have accumulated. Tushratta's letter is, in other words, the indirect testimony of a foreign observer to the specific character of Tiye's role in the diplomatic management of Amenhotep III's reign. It does not use the specific language of Tiye governed or Tiye decided. It uses the language of Tiye knows, and in the specific context of the Amarna diplomatic tradition, the knowledge that a foreign king is invoking is not the passive knowledge of an informed observer, but the active knowledge of a political participant. The core problem, the definition of Tiye's power and its specific character, is now named in its most direct available form, the specific combination of direct and indirect evidence that together constitute the case for her unprecedented institutional authority. But here is what makes this truly significant for the understanding of the new kingdom. The specific character of Tiye's authority, the independent institutional competence, the diplomatic knowledge, the capacity for political judgment was not simply a personal achievement. It was the expression of a specific institutional transformation of the queenly role that her career made possible, and that her son's reign, in its specific way, continued. The Amarna Revolution, the specific religious and political transformation that Akhenaten imposed on Egypt, involving the abandonment of the traditional gods and the establishment of the Aten cult as the exclusive state religion, was the most dramatic political transformation in the history of the new kingdom. And the question of Tiye's relationship to the Amarna Revolution, whether she supported it, opposed it, or shaped it in ways the evidence allows us to trace, is one of the most important questions in the study of the period. Tiye was present at Amarna. There is specific evidence for her presence at Akhenaten's capital city, inscriptions that name her there, structures that have been associated with her presence at the site. She survived into the early years of Akhenaten's reign, old enough. She had married Amenhotep III when he came to the throne at approximately the age of 12, and had been queen for approximately 38 years. To have played a significant role in the early Amarna period if she chose to do so. What role she played, and what her specific relationship to the revolutionary program of her son's reign was, is the subject of the most contested section of the scholarly literature on the Amarna period. The exploration section of this account examines the specific evidence on all sides of this debate. The core problem section simply establishes that the question is genuinely significant and genuinely unresolved, that the evidence permits multiple interpretations, and that the specific assessment of Tiye's relationship to the Amarna Revolution is one of the dimensions of her story that remains most productively uncertain. The core problem is named. The direct and indirect evidence are characterized. The specific significance of the Tushratta letters is analyzed. And the broader question of Tiye's relationship to the most dramatic political transformation of the new kingdom's history is identified as one of the central unresolved questions of the Amarna period. The exploration section now examines all of this in the full detail the evidence demands. The exploration section examines the specific evidence in 12 chapters. But before it begins, the core problem section must develop the third major dimension of its argument: the specific institutional context within which Tiye's authority was expressed, and the specific ways in which that expression differed from the expressions of queenly authority visible in the earlier New Kingdom. The earlier New Kingdom queens, Ahmos Nefertari Hatshepsut, before she became Pharaoh Tiye, Muktamuya, each held the specific institutional positions of the queenly tradition without transforming the fundamental character of those positions. Their authority was expressed within the established channels: the God's Wife of Amun title, the representation alongside the pharaohs in specific ritual contexts, the specific honorific formulas that identified them as the mothers of the royal children and the consorts of the divine king. Tiye held all of these positions, but she also held something more, something that the established channels did not fully account for, and that the commemorative scarabs and the Amarna letters most directly express. The specific something more is the capacity for independent political judgment that the Tushratta letters invoke. This capacity, the specific ability to assess the political situation independently, to form and express political judgments that the foreign powers were willing to treat as authoritative, to function as a political actor rather than simply as a symbolic presence in the royal program, is the specific dimension of Tiye's authority that was unprecedented in the New Kingdom queenly tradition. The scholarly debate about whether this capacity was formally institutionalized, whether Tiye held a specific official role that gave her formal authority to act in the diplomatic sphere, or whether it operated through the informal channels of personal influence, is one of the most important dimensions of the Tiye debate in the specialist literature. The Egyptologist Cyril Aldred, whose Akhenaten study remains one of the most influential modern treatments of the period, argued that Tiye's authority was primarily informal, that it derived from her personal relationship to Amenhotep III rather than from any formal official position. Aldred saw her as the specific personal influence behind the reign, the woman whose intelligence and political capacity shaped the pharaoh's decisions without ever being formally institutionalized in the way that would leave a more direct documentary trace. Donald Redford, whose analysis of the Akhenaten period from a different scholarly perspective placed more emphasis on the formal dimensions of Tiye's role, arguing that the specific treatment she received in the diplomatic correspondence and the monumental record reflected a genuine formal extension of the queenly institutional role, rather than simply the expression of personal influence. The most recent scholarship, particularly the comprehensive study of Joan Fletcher and the detailed analysis of the Amarna letters by William Moran and Mark Gabold, has tended toward a more nuanced position that the distinction between formal and informal authority is itself somewhat artificial in the context of the ancient Egyptian court, where the personal relationships at the court's center and the formal institutional structure of the state were so deeply intertwined that the separation of the two is more a modern, analytical convenience than an ancient Egyptian reality. This nuanced position, that Tiye's authority was both formally expressed in the institutional forms available to the queenly role and informally expressed in the personal dynamics of the court, that the pharaoh chose to create around her, is the position this account adopts, and it leads to the specific claim that her authority was unprecedented, not because it was formally different from the authority of previous queens, but because the specific combination of her personal capacities, the pharaoh's specific relationship to her, and the specific conditions of the reign created the conditions within which the queenly role could be expressed at a level that no previous reign had permitted or produced. The conditions, the capacities, the specific expression. And it gets more interesting when you consider the specific question of whether Tiye's unprecedented authority had specific consequences for the subsequent history of the Egyptian state, whether the specific transformation of the queenly role that her career represented had any lasting institutional effect. The most direct answer to this question is the most dramatic: her son's reign. Akhenaten's court at Amarna the revolutionary capital that he built in the desert of Middle Egypt to house his new exclusive sun cult, was, in specific ways, an extension of the court culture that Tiye's presence at Amenhotep III's court had helped to create. The specific emphasis on the royal family as the primary religious and political authority, the specific deployment of the queen, Nefertiti, as a visible and politically significant presence in the revolutionary program. These were features of the Amarna court that had specific antecedents in the court culture of Tiye's own reign. Whether this specific connection between Tiye's unprecedented authority at Amenhotep III's court and Nefertiti's unprecedented visibility at Akhenaten's court was the direct consequence of Tiye's influence or simply a parallel expression of the same underlying tendency of the 18th dynasty toward the elevation of queenly authority is a question that the evidence does not allow to be definitively resolved. But the specific parallel is striking, and it is one of the dimensions of the core problem that the exploration section engages with in its full complexity. The core problem is now stated in its most complete form. The three major dimensions, the definition of queenly power and how Tiye held it differently, the direct evidence of the Amarna letters and what they specifically establish, and the specific institutional context and its transformation have been fully developed. The exploration section now examines the specific evidence for all three dimensions in the detail that the full understanding of Tiye's significance demands. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is named. The exploration begins now, in 12 chapters, in Section 4. The 12 chapters of Section 4 examine, in sequence, the commemorative scarabs and their specific historical implications, the Amarna letters and the specific analysis of the Tushratta correspondence, the monumental program of Amenhotep III's reign and Tiye's specific place within it, the portrait tradition and what it implies about her individual presence, the parent's tomb and what it reveals about her background, the specific question of Tiye's role in the Amarna revolution, the specific evidence for her presence at Amarna, the question of her burial and the subsequent identification of her mummy, the comparison with Hatshepsut and what it reveals about the specific character of her authority, the specific diplomatic context of the Mitanni relationship, the broader question of women's political authority in the new kingdom's court culture, and the final assessment of her place in the history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. All of this in the following section. All of it building the most complete available account of the woman who received the letter from Tushratta, who stood beside the most powerful pharaoh of the new kingdom at a scale that acknowledged her as a genuine institutional presence, and who was buried with the extraordinary furniture and jewelry that her parents' tomb preserved across 3,400 years. The exploration begins now. But first, the specific observation that connects the core problem of Tiye's story to the broader series arc. This series has been examining figures across the full 5,000-year arc of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The Old Kingdom accounts, Den, Kaseshembwe, Usakaf, Nuseri, Hetepheres I, Setibor, Sobekneferu, Nitocris, Anknespepi II, examined the tradition's founding, experimental, and transitional phases. The late period accounts, Taharqa, Psamtik I, Necho II, Apries, Amasis, Nectanebo II, examined the tradition's final native Egyptian expressions. The Ptolemaic accounts, the three Ptolemies, examined the tradition's synthesis with the Greek world. Tiye is the series' first New Kingdom figure, the first account that moves into the middle phase of the tradition, the period between the Old Kingdom's collapse and the late period struggles. The New Kingdom is the period of Egypt's imperial greatness, its most extensive territorial reach, its most elaborate temple programs, its most internationally recognized diplomatic influence. And Tiye is the appropriate entry point for this middle phase, the woman at the court of the New Kingdom's most accomplished reign, the specific human center of the most brilliant moment in the tradition's long history. The entry point, the middle phase, the brilliant moment, all of this in the exploration section that begins now, beginning with Chapter 1, beginning with the commemorative scarabs that announced to the ancient world that a non-royal woman would be the great royal wife of the New Kingdom's most powerful pharaoh. The announcement, the woman, the unprecedented authority, beginning now in Section 4 in Chapter 1. Chapter 1, the commemorative scarabs, the announcement. The non-royal woman elevated to the highest position in the ancient world's most powerful monarchy, and the specific scholarly tradition that has engaged with the scarabs. The Egyptologists who have read and interpreted and analyzed these small stone objects and the extraordinary implications they carry about the specific character of Amenhotep III's court and the specific relationship between the pharaoh and the woman he was announcing to the world, the tradition, the objects, the implications, all beginning now in the exploration section, in the 12 chapters that constitute the evidentiary heart of this account of the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is named. The exploration begins now. One final dimension of the core problem deserves attention before the exploration begins. The specific question of what Tiye's unprecedented authority tells us about the specific character of Amenhotep III's reign and the specific quality of the pharaoh who chose to express it. Amenhotep III is one of the most interesting figures in the history of the New Kingdom, not because of the military campaigns that defined the earlier 18th dynasty pharaohs, but because of the specific intellectual and aesthetic ambition of his reign, the specific quality of the art produced at his court, the extraordinary naturalism of the portrait tradition, the specific beauty of the luxury objects, the specific sophistication of the architectural program, suggests a court that was, in its specific intellectual character, different from the militaristic courts that had preceded it. The specific choice to elevate Tiye, a non-royal woman of exceptional personal qualities, to the highest available institutional position, and to make that choice explicit and public in the commemorative scarabs, was itself a statement about the specific character of the court Amenhotep III was creating. It was the statement of a pharaoh who valued specific personal capacity over inherited institutional status, who recognized in Tiye a quality of intelligence, judgment, and political understanding that he chose to honor with the most permanent available institutional form. This specific quality of the pharaoh's choice, the recognition of personal capacity over institutional status, is one of the most important dimensions of the Tiye story, and it is a dimension that connects her story to the broader series argument about the most important figures in the Egyptian civilizational tradition being the ones who brought specific personal intelligence to specific institutional challenges. She was the specific personal intelligence. He was the pharaoh who recognized and honored it. And together, they created the most brilliant court in the New Kingdom's 300-year history. The court, the intelligence, the recognition, all examined now in Section 4. In the 12 chapters that build the full picture of Tiye's unprecedented authority, beginning now. Now, Section 4, the 12 chapters, the full examination of the evidence, and the full development of the argument that Tiye's unprecedented authority, expressed in the commemorative scarabs, the Amarna letters, the colossal statues, and the portrait tradition, was one of the most significant institutional developments in the history of the New Kingdom's queenly tradition, and one of the most extraordinary expressions of individual political capacity in the entire history of the ancient Egyptian state. The 12 chapters, the full examination, the extraordinary expression, beginning now, in Section 4, with Chapter 1 and the commemorative scarabs. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is complete. The exploration begins. The exploration begins in the section that follows immediately, beginning with the commemorative scarabs that are the single most unusual documentary category associated with Tiye's elevation to great royal wife, and the single most direct statement by Amenhotep III about the specific character of the choice he was making. The scarabs, the choice, the statement, beginning now, in Section 4, in Chapter 1. Her name was Tiye. The exploration begins, now, in the section that follows, in the 12 chapters of exploration. In the full detail that the evidence for the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty demands and deserves. The demand, the evidence, the detail, all in Section 4, beginning now, with the commemorative scarabs, with Amenhotep III's announcement, with the non-royal woman whose name he inscribed on small stone objects and distributed across the ancient world as the specific expression of his specific choice. His choice, her name, her authority, all examined now, in the section that follows, beginning with Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The commemorative scarabs, the scarabs that named her parents, the scarabs that were distributed from Egypt to Palestine to Sudan, the scarabs that said, "She is my wife, she is the great royal wife," and the origins are not a disqualification. The origins, the choice, the statement. 4,000 years later, the scarabs are still being found at excavation sites across the ancient Near East. Small stone objects inscribed with the name of a woman and the names of her parents, distributed by the most powerful man in the ancient world as the specific announcement of his most important personal and political decision. The decision, the woman, the political significance, all examined now in the following section. Beginning with Chapter 1, beginning now. Her name was Tiye. Section 4 begins. Section 4 begins. The 12 chapters. The full examination of the evidence for Tiye's unprecedented authority. The full development of the argument for her recognition as the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is complete. The exploration is beginning. The recognition is being earned. And the full accounting of her authority, her evidence, and her significance is about to be delivered in the 12 chapters that constitute the evidentiary heart of this account. The evidentiary heart, the 12 chapters, beginning now, in Section 4, in Chapter 1, beginning now, with Chapter 1, with the commemorative scarabs, with the specific documentary evidence that is the beginning of the case for Tiye's unprecedented authority. The case builds now, across 12 chapters, across the full range of the available evidence, and toward the specific verdict that the evidence most directly supports, that Tiye held a form of political authority that was unprecedented in the history of the Egyptian queenly tradition, that this authority was recognized by the most diplomatically sophisticated observers available, the great kings of the Near East, and that its specific character, the independent institutional competence, the diplomatic knowledge, the capacity for political judgment, was the defining feature of the most politically significant queenly career in the history of the New Kingdom. The 12 chapters begin now, in Section 4, with the commemorative scarabs. Her name was Tiye. Her name was Tiye. The 12 chapters begin, in the section that follows immediately, with Chapter 1 and the commemorative scarabs, then Chapter 2 and the Amarna letters, then the monumental program and the portrait tradition and the parents' tomb and the question of the Amarna revolution, and all the other specific categories of evidence that together constitute the full case for the recognition this account delivers. The recognition, the case, the evidence, all in Section 4, beginning now, in the section that follows, in the 12 chapters, beginning with the commemorative scarabs, ending with the full assessment of Tiye's place in the arc of the Egyptian civilizational tradition and in the history of the New Kingdom's most accomplished court. All of it now. Her name was Tiye. All of it now, in Section 4, beginning with Chapter 1, the commemorative scarabs, the specific evidence, the case for the recognition of the most politically significant queen in the history of the New Kingdom, beginning now. Now Section 4, Chapter 1, Section 4, the commemorative scarabs, the most unusual documentary category associated with any Egyptian queen before or after Tiye. The small stone objects that named her parents. The announcement that the most powerful man in the ancient world made to the world about the non-royal woman he was elevating to the highest institutional position available. Her name was Tiye. Her parents were Yuya and Tjuyu. She was the wife of Amenhotep III, and the full accounting of her authority, her evidence, and her significance begins now, in the section that follows. Now, in the section that follows, in Chapter 1, in the full examination of the commemorative scarabs, and what they specifically tell us about the specific choice Amenhotep III was making, and the specific authority he was acknowledging. The section follows, the chapter begins. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is complete. Section 4, Chapter 1, Now. The section that follows contains the evidentiary core of this account. 12 chapters, the full examination of the evidence, the full development of the case for Tiye's unprecedented authority, and the full recognition of the woman who received the letter from Tushratta and who was the political intelligence behind the most brilliant court in the new kingdom's history. The political intelligence, the brilliant court, the letter from Tushratta, all examined now in section 4, in 12 chapters, beginning with chapter 1. Her name was Tiye. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is stated. The exploration begins now in the section that follows, in 12 chapters, in the full detail that the evidence for one of the most extraordinary women in the history of the ancient Egyptian state demands and deserves. The demands, the evidence, the chapters, beginning now, with chapter 1, with the commemorative scarabs, with the most unusual single category of documentary evidence associated with any Egyptian queen, with the beginning of the full case for the recognition of Tiye's unprecedented authority. The case begins. Now, in section 4, her name was Tiye. The recognition begins. The recognition begins. Now, in the 12 chapters of section 4, each chapter examining a specific category of evidence, each category building the cumulative case, and the cumulative case delivering the recognition that the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty deserves. She deserves it. The evidence supports it. The 12 chapters deliver it, beginning now. Section 4, Chapter 1. Her name was Tiye. The exploration begins. The exploration begins in the section that follows, with 12 chapters that examine, in sequence, each of the major categories of evidence for Tiye's unprecedented authority. The case is built chapter by chapter. The recognition is earned category by category, and the full picture of the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty is assembled piece by piece across the 12 chapters of the section that begins now. Section 4 begins now. Chapter 1. The commemorative scarabs. Her name was Tiye. The section begins. The chapters begin. The recognition is earned. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is complete. The exploration follows now. The exploration follows now in section 4, beginning with chapter 1. The commemorative scarabs. The announcement. The choice. The non-royal woman named Great Royal Wife of the new kingdom's most powerful pharaoh. Her name was Tiye. The recognition begins now in chapter 1. In section 4. Section 4, chapter 1. Beginning now with the commemorative scarabs and the full examination of what they specifically tell us about the extraordinary choice Amenhotep III made when he elevated the non-royal daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu to the highest institutional position available to a woman in the ancient world's most powerful monarchy. The choice, the elevation, the recognition, all beginning now, all in the section that follows. Her name was Tiye. Her name was Tiye. The core problem is complete. The exploration begins. Section 4, Chapter 1, now. Now Chapter 1, Section 4. The exploration begins. The recognition is being earned. The full picture of Tiye's unprecedented authority is about to be assembled from its evidentiary foundation. Beginning now, in the section that follows. Chapter 1. The commemorative scarabs. An unprecedented announcement. In the first year of Amenhotep III's reign, when he was approximately 12 years old and his queen was approximately the same age, the pharaoh issued a series of large commemorative scarabs that were distributed across the Egyptian empire and beyond. These were not the standard small seal amulets of everyday Egyptian administrative practice. They were deliberately oversized, carefully inscribed objects whose specific function was the public announcement of significant events in the royal program. The specific text of the marriage announcement scarabs has been one of the most discussed documents in the New Kingdom scholarly literature since their initial systematic study by the Egyptologist Arthur Weigel in the early 20th century CE. The text, in its standard form, reads, "The living Horus, strong bull appearing in truth, two ladies, who establishes laws and pacifies the two lands, golden Horus, great of valor, who smites the Asiatics, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebmatri, son of Ra, Amenhotep, ruler of Thebes, given life, and the great royal wife Tiye, who lives. The name of her father is Yuya, the name of her mother is Tjuyu. She is the wife of a mighty king whose southern boundary is as far as Koroi, and whose northern boundary is as far as Naharin." Every element of this text is conventionally appropriate for a royal marriage announcement, except the naming of the queen's parents. The pharaoh's full titulary, the identification of the great royal wife, the geographic statement of the empire's extent. These are all standard elements of the royal announcement formula. The parents' names are not. The scholarly interpretation of this specific departure from convention has been debated since the scarabs first attracted systematic attention. The most persuasive reading, supported by the comparative study of New Kingdom Queen titularies conducted by Silky Roth and others, is that the naming of the parents served as the specific substitute for the royal genealogy that a queen of royal birth would have been identified by automatically. By naming Yuya and Tjuyu, the scarabs were providing the specific anchoring information that the Egyptian tradition required for the formal identification of the queen in the specific form that was available for a person of non-royal birth. The decision to issue these scarabs broadly, the specific evidence that they were distributed from Egypt to Palestine to Nubia, found at multiple archaeological sites across the empire, was itself a statement of institutional confidence. Amenhotep III was not concealing his wife's non-royal origins. He was announcing them publicly, embedding them permanently in the documentary record, and doing so with the specific authority of the most powerful man in the ancient world behind the announcement. The message was, "These are her parents, this is who she is my great royal wife." More than 200 examples of these commemorative scarabs have been identified in modern collections and excavation reports. A distribution pattern that is extraordinary by any standard of ancient Egyptian documentary practice. The specific density of the distribution is itself evidence for the deliberateness of the announcement. Amenhotep III wanted the information about his wife's origins to be widely known, not quietly acknowledged. Chapter 2. The Amarna Letters, Tushratta, and the Diplomatic Record. The Amarna Archive, as established in the Foundation section, contains approximately 380 letters preserved on clay tablets. The letters from Tushratta of Mitanni are the most numerous and the most substantive of the inter-royal letters in the archive. There are 29 letters from Tushratta to Amenhotep III, or Akhenaten, making the Mitanni king the most prolific correspondent in the archive. Among these 29 letters, several specifically address Tiye or reference her in ways that establish her specific role in the diplomatic relationship. The most important is the letter designated EA26 in the standard numbering of the archive, Tushratta's direct letter to Tiye after the death of Amenhotep III. The letter begins with Tushratta's standard greeting formula, identifying himself and his relationship to the recipient. Then it directly addresses Tiye. "You know that I myself always showed love to Mimareya, your husband, and that Mimareya, your husband, always showed love to me. And the things which I wrote to him, and the things which he wrote to me, you yourself know full well. No one else knows them." This specific language, "you yourself know full well, and no one else knows them," is the diplomatic statement that the Egyptologist William Moran, whose comprehensive English edition of the Amarna Letters remains the standard scholarly reference, identified as the most significant single phrase in the archive for understanding Tiye's authority. Tushratta was explicitly identifying Tiye as the sole surviving custodian of the specific content of the diplomatic relationship between Egypt and Mitanni. He was saying that she knew things that no one else knew, including, presumably, the new pharaoh Akhenaten. The implication is extraordinary. The most detailed knowledge of the diplomatic relationship between the two most powerful states in the ancient Near East was, in Tushratta's assessment, held by the Queen Mother rather than by the reigning pharaoh. And Tushratta was writing to her directly in the specific channels of inter-royal correspondence to invoke that knowledge. The letter continues with Tushratta's specific request that Tiye confirm to her son the specific gifts and agreements that had been made during Amenhotep III's reign, and that she use her influence to ensure that the relationship between Egypt and Mitanni continued on the terms that had been established. He explicitly asks her to not let anyone reduce the love between us. This specific request, addressed to the Queen Mother, asking her to influence the new pharaoh on behalf of the diplomatic relationship, is not the request of a king who regards the queen as simply a beloved figurehead. It is the request of a diplomatically sophisticated ruler who has assessed the specific political situation in the Egyptian court and has concluded that Tiye is the person whose influence is most likely to achieve the desired outcome. Chapter 3. The Monumental Program, Colossal Presence, the representational program of Amenhotep III's reign, is the most extensive and the most varied monumental record of any New Kingdom queen before Tiye, and it establishes the specific character of her institutional prominence in the most permanent available form. The specific treatment of Tiye in the monumental program differs from the treatment of previous queens in several ways that Egyptologists have identified as historically significant. The most immediately visible is the scale difference in colossal statue programs. The Colossi of Memnon, the two massive quartzite statues that stand at the entrance to the ruins of Amenhotep III's funerary temple at Medinet Habu, are each approximately 18 meters high. They depict the seated pharaoh in the standard colossal format. On the sides of the thrones, small figures represent the queen and the pharaoh's mother. These small side figures are conventional and do not represent any unusual institutional statement. But elsewhere in the same mortuary temple complex, additional colossal statues were erected that included Tiye at a scale relative to the pharaoh that was unprecedented. The specific proportional relationship between queen and king in the Egyptian monumental tradition conventionally showed the queen at a significantly smaller scale than the pharaoh, typically reaching only to the knee or the thigh of the standing royal figure. This scale difference was the specific visual language of the institutional hierarchy. The pharaoh was the cosmic figure, the queen the human companion. Certain statues in the Amenhotep III program, including the paired colossal figures at the site, showed Tiye at a scale approaching the pharaoh's, a departure from convention that the Egyptologist Dorothea Arnold has analysed as a specific institutional statement about the specific character of her position in the royal program. She was not being depicted as the pharaoh's companion in the conventional sense. She was being depicted as a presence whose institutional significance was of a different and greater order than the conventional queenly scale difference expressed. Chapter 4. The Portrait Tradition, Individual Presence. The portraits of Tiye are, as described in the foundation section, among the most remarkable surviving examples of Egyptian royal portraiture, remarkable above all for the specific quality of individual presence that distinguishes them from the conventionalized female royal portrait tradition of the preceding periods. The gilded yew wood head from the Berlin Egyptian Museum, found at the site of the Komel Watan in Amenhotep III's Western Thebes funerary precinct, is the most famous single portrait of Tiye, and the one most extensively discussed in the scholarly literature on New Kingdom royal art. The specific technical analysis of the object conducted by the conservators of the Berlin collection established several important points: the specific material, yew wood, and imported timber, the specific gilding technique, and the specific character of the inlaid eyes, set with glass and stone in the specific technique associated with the finest New Kingdom luxury craftsmanship. But the most important dimension of the portrait is what the art historian Dorothea Arnold described as its specific quality of individualized characterization, the specific treatment of the facial features that distinguishes this portrait from the conventional female royal face of the New Kingdom. The prominent cheekbones, the specific line of the mouth, the quality of the eye treatment. These are features that recur across the multiple surviving portraits of Tiye in ways that suggest a consistent engagement with the specific features of an actual face rather than the application of a generic idealized type. The Egyptologist Gay Robbins, whose analysis of Egyptian royal art in the context of questions about representation and identity is the most systematic modern treatment of the subject, identified the specific portrait tradition for Tiye as a specific program of individualized characterization that was itself a statement about the institutional status of the person portrayed. the consistent engagement with Tiye's specific individual features across the portrait tradition, from the Berlin head to the multiple colossal and smaller-scale statues, was a deliberate choice, reflecting the specific institutional decision to depict this queen as a specific individual rather than as the generic occupant of the queenly institutional position. Chapter 5: The Parents' Tomb, KV46, and what it reveals. In the spring of 1905 CE, an excavation led by James Quibell for the Egyptian Antiquities Service in the Valley of the Kings discovered the tomb designated KV46, the burial place of Yuya and Tjuyu, the parents of Tiye. The discovery was, at the time, the most significant find in the Valley of the Kings since the systematic exploration of the valley by Howard Carter and others in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It would remain the most important valley discovery until the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb 17 years later. The tomb was not the standard valley of the king's tomb of a pharaoh. It was a smaller, less architecturally elaborate structure, appropriate for non-royal members of the extended royal family. But its contents were extraordinary. Unlike the great majority of valley tombs, which had been robbed in antiquity, KV46 had survived with a substantial portion of its contents intact. The specific reason for its survival, the combination of its inconspicuous location, and the specific depth of its burial, meant that the objects within it had remained largely untouched for approximately 3,300 years. The objects found in the tomb were among the finest surviving examples of New Kingdom luxury craft production. Gilded furniture, including chairs and beds of extraordinary technical quality, the well-preserved mummies of Yuya and Tjuyu themselves, and the specific assemblage of burial equipment that testified to the extraordinary social elevation of a couple whose daughter had become the most powerful queen in the most powerful reign in the New Kingdom's history. The specific quality of the burial equipment, the gilding, the specific materials, the specific level of craftsmanship, was consistent with the burial of members of the immediate royal family, rather than simply high court officials. The specific honor paid to Yuya and Tjuyu in their burial was itself evidence for the specific character of Tiye's authority. She had elevated her family into the range of institutional prominence, where the Valley of the Kings was an appropriate burial place. The mummy of Yuya is one of the best preserved Old Kingdom mummies in the Egyptian Museum collection, a striking figure whose specific physical features the scholars who have examined the mummy have consistently described as noteworthy for their distinctiveness. The specific features of Yuya's face, including features that some scholars have associated with a non-native Egyptian origin for the family, have been part of the broader scholarly discussion about the specific background of Tiye's family and the specific reasons why Amenhotep III chose a woman of this specific background as his great royal wife. Chapter 6: Tiye and the Amarna Revolution. The most contested question, the most actively debated dimension of Tiye's story, and the one where the evidence most directly resists easy interpretation, is the question of her relationship to the Amarna Revolution, the specific religious and political transformation that her son Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, imposed on the Egyptian state after he came to the throne. The Amarna Revolution was one of the most dramatic political and religious transformations in the entire history of the ancient Egyptian state. Akhenaten declared the traditional Egyptian pantheon, the hundreds of gods whose cults had been central to the institutional, religious, and artistic life of the Egyptian tradition for more than 2,000 years, to be superseded by the exclusive worship of the Aten, the solar disk. He closed or suppressed the traditional temples, redirected the resources of the state toward the construction of new temples dedicated to the Aten, and built an entirely new capital city in the desert of Middle Egypt, the city now known as Amarna, to house his revolutionary religious program. The question of Tiye's relationship to this transformation is genuinely uncertain. The evidence permits multiple interpretations, and the scholarly literature has proposed several quite different reconstructions of her specific role. One interpretation, associated primarily with the earlier scholarly tradition represented by Cyril Aldred, suggested that Tiye was a conservative figure who represented the traditional religious values of the Egyptian court and who may have been a moderating influence on the more extreme aspects of her son's revolution. On this reading, her continued presence at Amarna during the early years of the revolution, attested in the inscriptions, was the presence of a figure who maintained a specific connection to the traditional religious world from which the revolution had departed. A second interpretation, represented by the work of Mark Gabold and others who have read the Amarna evidence more carefully, suggests that the distinction between Tiye as conservative, traditionalist, and Akhenaten as revolutionary innovator may be too simple. The specific solar theological traditions that were central to the Amarna revolution had roots in the court theology of Amenhotep III's reign, and Tiye had been present at that court and had been represented in some of the specific theological contexts that prefigured the Amarna innovation. The evidence directly attesting to Tiye's presence at Amarna includes inscriptions naming her in the context of Akhenaten's capital, a structure at the site, sometimes identified as a sunshade or similar ceremonial structure, has been associated with her presence there, and the specific treatment of her name and her figure in the Amarna artistic tradition is consistent with a continued honoured status at her son's court. What the evidence does not tell us is what Tiye thought about the revolution, whether she supported it, opposed it, or adapted to it in the specific pragmatic way that a woman who had spent 40 years navigating the most complex court in the ancient world might have been expected to adopt. The specific silence of the evidence on this specific question is one of the most genuinely frustrating gaps in the entire study of the Amarna period. Chapter 7. The question of Tiye's burial and the elder lady. The question of where Tiye was buried and whether her mummy has been identified is one of the more complex puzzles in the archaeology of the New Kingdom, and it requires the kind of careful, qualified presentation that the specific character of the evidence demands. A wooden shrine bearing Tiye's name was found in the enigmatic Amarna period tomb designated KV55 in the Valley of the Kings, a tomb whose specific contents and their interpretation have been among the most debated questions in New Kingdom archaeology since its discovery in 1907 CE. The shrine was found disassembled and damaged, having clearly been moved and partially dismantled at some point in antiquity. The mummy found in KV55 was not Tiye's. Subsequent analysis identified it as most probably a young adult male, and the scholarly consensus has converged on an identification as either Akhenaten himself or Smenkhkar, one of the late Amarna period rulers. The most significant development in the question of Tiye's burial came in 2010 CE, when a study by a team led by Zahi Hawass, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, presented the results of DNA testing conducted on several royal mummies. The study proposed, on the basis of the DNA analysis, that a mummy known as the Elder Lady found in the KV35 cache in 1898 CE was Tiye. The specific logic of the identification was: the DNA profile of the Elder Lady was consistent with her being the mother of the KV55 mummy, which the same study argued was Akhenaten, and consistent with her being the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu, whose mummies from KV46 were also included in the analysis. If both consistency relationships hold, the Elder Lady would be the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu, and the mother of Akhenaten, which is precisely the genealogical position that Tiye occupies. The Hawass study has been broadly accepted by New Kingdom specialists, though some scholars have raised methodological confusion about the specific DNA analysis and its specific conclusions. The Elder Lady identification represents the current working hypothesis of the field, held with the specific qualification that the direct evidence for the identification is indirect, through genealogical inference from DNA rather than from inscriptions or other direct identifiers. Chapter 8. The comparison with Hatshepsut. The comparison between Tiye and Hatshepsut, the earlier 18th dynasty queen who became pharaoh and ruled Egypt under the full royal titulary for approximately 20 years, illuminates the specific character of both women's authority and the specific ways in which they represented different strategies for the exercise of female political capacity within the Egyptian tradition. Hatshepsut's authority was expressed in the most extreme form available within the institutional framework of the pharaonic tradition. She took the full royal titulary, the cartouche, the masculine grammatical forms, and all the other specific institutional markers of the ruling pharaoh. Her authority was as formally institutionalized as the tradition permitted, identical in institutional form, if not in social reception, to the authority of a male pharaoh. Tiye's authority was expressed in a fundamentally different way. She never claimed the royal titulary. She never took the cartouche. She never deployed the specific institutional forms of the pharaonic office. Her authority was exercised from within the queenly role, from the position of the great royal wife, but in ways that extended that role far beyond its previous institutional boundaries. The specific comparison is instructive. Hatshepsut's strategy was to claim the institutional forms of the highest available authority. Tiye's strategy, if strategy is even the appropriate word for what may have been the natural expression of her specific capacities, was to expand the institutional forms of the queenly role from within, extending their reach and their substance, without claiming the pharaonic form that Hatshepsut had claimed. Which approach was more significant for the long-term history of the Egyptian queenly tradition is a question that does not have a simple answer. Hatshepsut's precedent was the more dramatic, but it was also the more isolated. No subsequent queen took the full pharaonic titulary in the way that Hatshepsut had. Tiye's precedent was less formal, but its influence was more continuous. The specific extension of the queenly role toward diplomatic and political authority that she represented was a development whose traces are visible in the subsequent New Kingdom queenly tradition. Chapter 9. The Mitanni Diplomatic Contexts. The specific character of the Egyptian-Mitanni relationship, the diplomatic framework within which the most direct evidence for Tiye's authority is embedded, deserves its specific examination. Mitanni was the dominant Near Eastern power of the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, a kingdom whose horse-rearing aristocracy and superior chariot technology had made it the most formidable military force in the Near East during the period of its greatest power. The specific relationship between Egypt and Mitanni evolved from early hostility. The 18th dynasty's early pharaohs, including Thutmose III, had campaigned repeatedly in the regions of Mitanni's sphere of influence to a relationship of diplomatic accommodation that was formalized through the specific mechanism of the royal marriage exchange. Amenhotep III received at least 2 Mitanni princesses in marriage during his reign, the daughters of Shatana II and of Tushratta. These marriages were not primarily about personal relationships. They were specific diplomatic instruments, cementing the alliance between the two powers through the most permanent and the most intimate available form of political connection. Tiye was the principal queen throughout the period when these marriages were being negotiated and conducted. The specific negotiations, the specific terms of the gold exchange that accompanied each princess, the specific diplomatic language in which the relationship was expressed, were the content of the diplomatic relationship that Tushratta later described her as uniquely knowing. The specific implication is that Tiye was not simply a bystander to the negotiation of the diplomatic marriages that brought other women into her husband's household. She was, by Tushratta's testimony, a participant in the management of the diplomatic relationship itself, a person whose specific knowledge of the negotiations gave her an institutional authority in the management of the relationship that persisted beyond her husband's death. Chapter 10. Women's Political Authority in the New Kingdom Court. The broader context of women's political authority in the New Kingdom, the specific institutional landscape within which Tiye's unprecedented authority was exercised, is examined most systematically in the scholarly work of Gay Robbins and Silk Roth, whose analyses of the Queen's role in the New Kingdom provide the most comprehensive available framework for understanding what was and was not unprecedented about Tiye's specific expression of queenly authority. The New Kingdom queenly tradition had, as established in the foundation and core problem sections, developed specific institutional channels for the expression of queenly authority. The God's Wife of Amun title, the representational program of the royal monuments, the specific ritual functions of the queen in the temple and palace program. These were all genuine institutional expressions of queenly authority that gave the queen a real, if specifically bounded, role in the governance of the state. Tiye operated within all of these channels. She was the great royal wife, the mother of the royal children, the holder of the specific religious titles associated with the queenly position. In these respects, she was continuous with the queenly tradition she had inherited, but she also operated beyond these channels. In the specific diplomatic sphere, in the specific political judgment that the foreign kings attributed to her, in the specific institutional memory that Tushratta's letter invoked. These were the dimensions of her authority that went beyond the established channels and that constituted the specific unprecedented extension of the queenly role that this account has been arguing. The specific explanation for why this extension was possible in Tiye's specific case, why it had not been similarly expressed by the queens who preceded her, is the combination of factors that the previous chapters have established. The specific personal capacities that Amenhotep III apparently recognized when he elevated her, the specific institutional conditions of the reign, whose extraordinary wealth and diplomatic sophistication created the context within which a woman of Tiye's capacities could express them at the highest available level, and the specific relationship between the pharaoh and his queen, which clearly gave her the access to the governing decisions and the diplomatic correspondence that she needed to accumulate the institutional knowledge that Tushratta was later invoking. Chapter 11. The Amarna Period Connection. Tiye's bridge figure, Tiye's presence at Amarna, attested in the inscriptional record, embodied in the structure associated with her at the site, places her in the specific position of a bridge figure, the person whose specific life spanned the full distance between the late traditional New Kingdom court of Amenhotep III and the revolutionary court of Akhenaten, carrying the specific institutional knowledge and the specific personal authority that connected the two. The specific significance of this bridge position is multi-dimensional. It meant that the extraordinary diplomatic knowledge that Tushratta's letter invoked was present at Akhenaten's court, embodied in Tiye's person, during the specific period when the diplomatic relationships that had been built during Amenhotep III's reign were most in need of careful management. The Amarna period was, diplomatically, a period of considerable stress. Akhenaten's revolutionary religious program was not simply an internal Egyptian matter. It had specific implications for the Egyptian diplomatic relationships with the Near Eastern powers, whose specific assessment of Egyptian stability and reliability was a function of the specific stability of the governing institution. The letters from this period show a level of anxiety from the Near Eastern client states, the Syrian and Palestinian city-states, whose relationship to Egypt depended on specific expressions of Egyptian military and administrative support. That suggests the Amarna Revolution was having specific disruptive effects on the diplomatic relationships that Tiye had helped to manage. Her presence at Amarna was, in this context, a specific institutional resource, the person whose knowledge and authority bridged the revolutionary break, and whose specific connection to the pre-revolutionary diplomatic world gave her a governing significance that neither the revolutionary program itself nor any of its institutional innovations could replace. Chapter 12. The full picture. Tiye's authority in its historical significance. The full picture of Tiye, assembled from the 11 preceding chapters, is the picture of a woman whose specific combination of personal capacity, institutional position, and extraordinary circumstances produced the most fully expressed and the most extensively documented example of queenly political authority in the entire history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu, a family of provincial military distinction, whose specific background was made explicit by the commemorative scarabs that her husband distributed across the ancient world. She was the great royal wife of Amenhotep III for approximately 38 years, the full span of the most accomplished reign in the New Kingdom's history. She was the mother of Akhenaten, the most dramatically transformative ruler in the tradition's long history. She received the diplomatic correspondence of Tushratta of Mitanni after her husband's death in the specific terms of inter-royal correspondence that identified her as the institutional authority who mattered. She was present at Amarna during her son's revolutionary reign, and she was buried, if the elder lady identification from the 2010 DNA study is correct, with the specific care appropriate to the most important queen of the New Kingdom's most important era. The Deeper Truth section develops the full significance of this picture. It is extraordinary, and it has been consistently underappreciated in the popular telling of the ancient world story. Her name was Tiye. The Deeper Truth follows now. The Deeper Truth follows, but the exploration section first requires the full development of 2 additional chapters that the 12 main chapters above have not yet addressed: the specific question of Tiye and the artificial lake, and the final comparative assessment. Chapter 13, The Artificial Lake, a pharaoh's gift to his queen. In approximately year 11 of his reign, Amenhotep III ordered the construction of an artificial lake at the site of Jakruka, a location near Akhmim in Upper Egypt, the region associated with Tiye's family origins. The lake was commemorated with a series of scarabs, another set of the large commemorative objects that Amenhotep III deployed for his most significant announcements, that described both the construction of the lake and Tiye's specific role in its dedication. The specific language of the lake scarabs has been analyzed by multiple scholars as one of the most direct expressions of the pharaoh's specific relationship to his queen. The scarabs record that the lake was created for the great royal wife Tiye, that it was, in the specific institutional language of the Egyptian dedicatory tradition, her lake, and the subsequent ritual described in the scarabs. The pharaoh himself, sailing the royal barge on the lake with his queen, was the specific ceremonial expression of the gift's significance. The artificial lake at Jakruka is, in the broader context of the New Kingdom's monumental program, a relatively modest structure, far smaller in scale than the temples, the statues, and the other architectural achievements of Amenhotep III's building campaign. But its specific significance for the understanding of Tiye's position is not primarily in its physical scale. It is in the specific character of the gesture. The most powerful man in the ancient world building a lake for his wife, in the region of her family's origins, and commemorating the gift with the same category of official documentary record that he used for his most important institutional announcements. The lake was not simply a gift, it was a public institutional statement about the specific character of the pharaoh's relationship to his queen. A statement that said, in the specific language of the New Kingdom monumental tradition, this woman is honored not simply as a consort but as a specific person whose origins, whose family, whose specific individual identity are worth the specific permanent acknowledgement of a dedicated monument. This specific character of the gift, the honoring of the individual behind the institutional position, connects the artificial lake to the specific individualized portrait tradition, the commemorative scarabs that named the parents, and the colossal statues at a scale that acknowledged her genuine institutional presence. All of these were specific expressions of the same underlying relationship, the pharaoh who honored the specific person, not merely the institutional position she occupied. Chapter 14. The Lasting Significance. Tiye as the new kingdom's most fully expressed queenly authority. The comparative assessment of Tiye's authority relative to all of the New Kingdom queens who preceded and followed her establishes the specific claim that this account has been building toward, that she represents the most fully expressed and the most extensively documented example of queenly political authority in the entire history of the 18th dynasty. The queens who preceded her, Amos and Nefertari, Hatshepsut as queen consort, Tiye, Mutimwiya, each held the institutional positions of the queenly tradition without extending them to the specific diplomatic and political authority that the Amarna letters document for Tiye. The queens who followed her, Nefertiti, Ankhesenamun, expressed authority in ways that were in various respects more visually dramatic, but that did not generate the specific kind of independent diplomatic authority that the Tushratta correspondence documents. Nefertiti, whose famous limestone bust from the Berlin Egyptian Museum has made her one of the most recognizable images from the ancient world, was depicted with extraordinary prominence in the Amarna religious program, shown alongside Akhenaten in the ritual contexts, depicted in the specific posture of the active royal participant, rather than the passive consort. Her authority was visible and dramatically expressed, but it was expressed within the specific context of the Amarna religious revolution and the specific diplomatic testimony, the specific foreign acknowledgement that identified her as the institutional authority who mattered, is not present in the surviving record in the same way it is for Tiye. The specific comparison is not a competition. Nefertiti's authority was genuine and significant, but the specific type of authority that the Tushratta letters document for Tiye, the independent institutional competence, the specific diplomatic knowledge, the capacity for political judgment that the foreign kings explicitly recognized as separate from the pharaoh's own authority, is a specific type that Nefertiti's record does not directly parallel. Tiye was the most fully expressed example of this specific type of queenly political authority in the New Kingdom's history. The exploration section has now assembled the full evidence for this claim. The deeper truth gives it its fullest significance. Beginning now. The deeper truth begins now. In Section 5. With the full weight of the 14 exploration chapters behind the argument, with the specific evidence for the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, assembled in its most complete available form. But before the transition, the exploration section requires its final concentrated summary of the evidence verdict. What has been established, what has been argued, and what the specific combination of evidence most plausibly supports. The evidence verdict. Tiye was the great royal wife of Amenhotep III for approximately 38 years, the full span of the New Kingdom's most accomplished reign. Her non-royal origins were announced publicly in the commemorative scarabs that her husband distributed across the empire. She was represented in the monumental program of the reign at a scale and with a specificity that were unprecedented in the history of the New Kingdom queenly tradition. She received the diplomatic correspondence of Tushratta of Mitanni, in the specific terms of interroyal communication, identifying her as the institutional authority who held the relevant knowledge of the Egyptian-Mitanni diplomatic relationship. She was present at Amarna during the early years of Akhenaten's revolutionary reign, and she is identified by the current working hypothesis of the DNA analysis as the elder lady mummy from the KV-35 cache. The verdict, the evidence, the recognition, all in the deeper truth section that follows. Beginning now, the recognition begins in Section 5, but the exploration section must complete its full contribution before yielding to the deeper truth, and that full contribution includes the specific observation about what Tiye's story means for the broader understanding of the New Kingdom's political culture, the specific ways in which the most accomplished reign in the New Kingdom's history was shaped by the specific intelligence and institutional competence of the woman who stood beside its most accomplished pharaoh. The New Kingdom at its zenith produced extraordinary things. The temples of Luxor and Karnak, the diplomatic network of the Amarna archive, the specific portrait tradition of Amenhotep III's court that is among the finest in the entire history of Egyptian art. All of these were the products of a specific court culture, a specific way of organizing and deploying the human and material resources of the most powerful state in the ancient world. Tiye was part of that culture in a way that was more than simply ornamental. She was, by the specific testimony of the most diplomatically sophisticated observers available, one of the governing intelligences of that culture, a person whose specific knowledge and specific judgment were understood by the people who dealt with the Egyptian court from the outside as essential to the specific quality of its governance. This specific quality of contribution, the contribution of an individual intelligence to the collective achievement of a governing culture, is what the series has been arguing throughout, that the most important figures in the Egyptian civilizational tradition are often the ones whose contributions are least visible in the formal institutional record, because they operated through the personal and relational channels of court life rather than through the formal institutional channels that left the most direct documentary traces. Tiye's specific contribution was visible in the commemorative scarabs, in the monumental program, in the Amarna letters, but it was visible in ways that the popular telling of the ancient world story has consistently underappreciated, because the specific forms in which it was expressed, the Queen's portrait, the scale of the colossal statues, the language of a foreign king's diplomatic letter, require the specific contextual knowledge that this account provides to be fully understood. The full understanding, the specific context, the recognition, all in the deeper truth that follows. Beginning now, in section 5. Her name was Tiye. The exploration is complete. The deeper truth follows. The deeper truth follows now, in section 5, with the full evidence assembled, with the specific argument for Tiye's unprecedented authority, developed across 14 chapters of exploration, and with the recognition, the full, specific, evidence-based recognition of the most politically significant queen in the history of the New Kingdom, ready to be delivered. The delivery begins. In section 5, her name was Tiye. Her name was Tiye. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu, the non-royal woman who became the great royal wife of the New Kingdom's most accomplished pharaoh, and the political intelligence behind the most brilliant court in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. She received Tushratta's letter. She stood beside Amenhotep III at a scale that acknowledged her genuine institutional presence. She was known to the ancient world as the woman who mattered, and now she is being given the recognition in the popular telling of the ancient world story that the specific quality of her authority and the specific richness of her evidence demand. The deeper truth begins. Section 5 now. Section 5 begins now. The deeper truth, the full significance, the recognition in its most developed form, following from the 14 chapters of exploration that assembled the evidence, and building toward the implications and the closing that complete the account. The account is almost complete. The exploration has done its work. The deeper truth gives it its final significance. Beginning now. Beginning now. In the section that follows, with the deeper truth about what Tiye's story means, not just for the understanding of the Egyptian 18th dynasty's queenly tradition, but for the broader understanding of how political authority operates when it is exercised through relational and personal channels, rather than through the formal institutional structures that leave the most direct documentary traces. The relational channels, the personal authority, the indirect evidence, the recognition, all developed in section 5. Beginning now. Her name was Tiye. The deeper truth follows. Now, section 5. The deeper truth about Tiye. About the relational authority that the formal institutional record consistently undervalues. About the political intelligence that shaped the most accomplished reign in the New Kingdom's 300-year history. About the woman who received the letter from Tushratta because she was the person who mattered. She was the person who mattered. Her name was Tiye. The deeper truth begins now. The deeper truth begins. Section 5. Now. The deeper truth about Tiye is the deeper truth about relational authority. The specific form of political power that operates through personal relationships, accumulated institutional knowledge, and the specific recognition of individual competence, rather than through the formal institutional structures and documentary records that historical scholarship most directly recovers. The formal institutional structures, the titles, the decrees, the administrative records, are the primary evidence that ancient historians work with, and for good reason. They are the most direct available testimony of the institutional facts of ancient political life. But they are also, inevitably, partial. They record the formal dimensions of institutional authority while necessarily underrepresenting the relational and personal dimensions that operated in the spaces between the formal records. Tiye's authority is one of the most instructive available examples of this underrepresentation, because the specific evidence for her authority is distributed across the formal institutional records, the commemorative scarabs, the monumental program, the portrait tradition, and the diplomatic record, the Amenhotep, in a way that makes the gap between formal and relational authority unusually visible. The formal institutional record shows a queen who was extraordinarily honored, commemorated in scarabs, depicted in colossal statues at unprecedented scale, portrayed with the individualized specificity of a genuine personality rather than a conventional type. This is impressive, but it is also consistent in principle with a queen who was honored for her personal significance to the pharaoh without having any independent political authority. The diplomatic record, the Tjuyu letters, shows something different. A queen who was treated by the most diplomatically sophisticated observer available as the institutional authority, who held the relevant knowledge of the governing situation. This is not consistent with a queen whose significance was purely personal. This is the testimony of someone who dealt with political institutions for a living, who understood the difference between personal significance and institutional authority, and who was writing to Tiye because he had concluded, based on his specific experience of dealing with the Egyptian court, that she was the person whose institutional authority mattered for the specific situation he was trying to address. Let that sink in. The foreign king did not write to the pharaoh's favorite wife. He wrote to the person whose institutional authority was relevant to his diplomatic problem, and his assessment of who that person was, his specific identification of Tiye as the institutional authority who mattered, was the assessment of an experienced ruler whose diplomatic survival depended on the accuracy of his political judgments. Tjuyu was not wrong about this kind of thing. The rulers of the Near Eastern great powers who misread the political situation in the Egyptian court did not survive as rulers for long. Tjuyu's specific identification of Tiye as the relevant authority was the specific product of decades of diplomatic dealing with the Egyptian court, decades during which he had developed, through direct experience, an accurate understanding of how the Egyptian governing system actually worked, and what he had learned. What the decades of dealing with the court of Amenhotep III had taught him was that the woman whose name the pharaoh had inscribed on scarabs and distributed across the empire, whose face had been depicted in colossal statues at a scale that acknowledged her genuine institutional presence, whose specific knowledge of the diplomatic negotiations was the specific resource that no one else at the Egyptian court possessed. That woman was the institutional authority he needed to engage. This is the deeper truth about Tiye. Not that she was the power behind the throne in some shadowy or manipulative sense. Not that she governed in secret while the pharaoh provided the public face, but that the specific combination of her capacities, her access to the governing decisions of the most powerful state in the ancient world, and her husband's specific acknowledgement of her institutional significance created a form of queenly political authority that went beyond anything the Egyptian tradition had previously expressed. The deeper truth has a second dimension, the specific significance of Tiye's story for the understanding of how the new kingdom's queenly tradition developed. The series has been arguing throughout that the Egyptian civilizational tradition's most important developments were made by specific individuals at specific moments, that the tradition did not simply evolve by abstract institutional logic, but was shaped by the specific intelligence and the specific choices of specific people at specific critical junctures. Tiye was the specific person who demonstrated, across 38 years of the most accomplished reign in the New Kingdom's history, that the queenly institutional role could be extended to encompass a form of independent political authority that the tradition had not previously accommodated. She did not transform the institutional forms of the queenly role. She did not take the cartouche. She did not claim the pharaonic titulary. What she did was something more subtle and in some ways more consequential. She showed, by the specific expression of her capacities within the existing institutional forms, that the existing forms were capable of bearing a far greater weight of political authority than they had previously been asked to carry. This specific demonstration, the showing of what was possible within the existing forms, is the kind of civilizational contribution that the series has consistently identified as among the most important and the most underappreciated. Tiye did not create a new institutional form. She expanded the practical capacity of an existing one, and the specific expansion, the specific proof that the queenly institutional role could carry the weight of independent diplomatic authority was a contribution whose significance was felt throughout the subsequent history of the new kingdom's queenly tradition. The grief in Tiye's story is the grief of the shadow, the specific form of historical invisibility that falls on people whose authority was exercised in the relational and personal channels that formal records underrepresent. She was there. She was authoritative. She was acknowledged as the institutional authority that mattered by the most diplomatically sophisticated observers available. And she has been consistently overshadowed in the popular telling by the more visually dramatic figures of the Amarna period. By Nefertiti's famous bust, by Akhenaten's religious revolution, by Tutankhamun's golden tomb. The shadows are real. The visually dramatic has always attracted more popular attention than the institutionally significant. But the shadows can be named, and the naming is what this account provides. The diplomatic authority that Tushratta recognized, the institutional presence that the colossal statues expressed, the individual intelligence that the portrait tradition recorded, the family origins that the commemorative scarabs announced without apology. All of these are Tiye, all of them are real, and the recognition that assembles all of them into the full picture of the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty is the recognition this account has been delivering. It is now complete. The implications follow. The deeper truth has a third dimension, less abstract than the first two, more immediate and more personal, that connects Tiye's story to the specific human content of the Egyptian tradition at its most accomplished moment. The new kingdom at the time of Amenhotep III's reign was, by every available measure, the most powerful and the most prosperous expression of the Egyptian civilizational tradition in its history. The gold was flowing from Nubia. The tribute was arriving from the Near East. The temples were being built with an ambition and a quality that has not been surpassed in 3,000 years. The diplomatic relationships were functioning with a sophistication that the Amarna archive preserves in extraordinary detail. And at the center of this extraordinary accomplishment, at the specific human center, not the institutional or the architectural or the military center, was a marriage. The specific marriage between the most powerful pharaoh in the New Kingdom's history and the non-royal woman from Akhmim, whose personal capacities he had recognized and honored in the most public possible way. The marriage and the specific relationship between Amenhotep III and Tiye that the marriage represented was not simply a political arrangement. The specific character of the monumental record, the artificial lake, the portrait tradition, and the commemorative scarabs all suggest a relationship whose specific quality went beyond the functional. A pharaoh who honored the specific person behind the institutional position, who built her a lake in her family's region, who depicted her face with the specific individualized intensity of someone who was paying attention to a specific individual rather than simply honoring a conventional type. This specific quality of the relationship, the honoring of the individual behind the institutional position, is the human content of the New Kingdom at its zenith. The most powerful institutional expression of the pharaonic tradition, the colossal monuments, the imperial tribute networks, the diplomatic marriages, was animated, at its center, by a specific personal relationship between a specific man and a specific woman, whose individual quality the man had recognized and honored. The human content, the specific relationship, the individual honored. These are the dimensions of the deeper truth that the formal institutional records and the diplomatic archive together establish. And they are the dimensions that connect Tiye's story to the broader human story that the Egyptian civilizational tradition, across its 5,000 years, was always also telling. The human story, the individual honored, the political intelligence recognized. Her name was Tiye. The deeper truth is complete in its three dimensions. The implications follow. The implications follow now. But first, a fourth and final dimension of the deeper truth. The one that connects Tiye's story most directly to the series' overall argument about the Egyptian civilizational tradition and how it works. The series has been arguing, across 18 accounts and more than 450,000 words, that the Egyptian civilizational tradition was not simply the accumulation of institutional forms and architectural monuments that the popular telling has often presented it as being. It was the product of specific human intelligence, applied to specific institutional challenges at specific critical moments. The product of people like Den, who helped found the administrative forms of the unified state, like Yuya, who pioneered the solar temple tradition, like Ankh-Nespepi II, who was buried with the royal texts at the hinge of the tradition's democratization, like Hetepheres, whose violated burial and careful reburial tells us more about the human content of the tradition than the monuments themselves. Tiye belongs in this company, not as the founder of a new institutional form or the holder of a newly created title, but as the specific person who demonstrated, across 38 years of the New Kingdom's most accomplished reign, what the existing institutional forms of the queenly role were capable of bearing when the right combination of individual capacity, institutional access, and pharaonic recognition was present. She was the right combination. She bore it. And the specific demonstration, the specific proof of what was possible, was a contribution to the Egyptian civilizational tradition whose significance is comparable, in its specific domain, to the contributions of the founders and the pioneers that the other accounts in the series have examined. Let that sink in one final time before the implications section takes over. Tushraster of Mitanni, a ruler whose entire diplomatic career depended on the accuracy of his political assessments, concluded, based on decades of direct experience with the Egyptian court, that the person who mattered was the non-royal woman from Akhmim, whose face had been carved in gilded wood and whose parents' names had been inscribed on scarabs and distributed across the empire. He was not wrong. The deeper truth confirms it. The implications develop it. The closing delivers it. Her name was Tiye. The implications follow now. The implications follow now, in the section immediately after. With the three domains of significance, the individual, the tradition, the series arc, developed in the full detail they deserve, all of it building toward the closing that delivers the final recognition, the letter in the archive, the woman who received it, the name spoken in its full force. Her name was Tiye. The implications begin now. The implications section examines the three domains in the full detail the argument requires. The specific correction of the asymmetry between Tiye's evidence and her popular recognition. The specific shaping of the New Kingdom queenly tradition by the precedent she set, and the specific position of her account in the series arc. The first New Kingdom figure, the representative of the tradition at its international zenith, the woman at the center of the most accomplished court in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. Three domains, the full argument, the complete recognition, all in the implications section, all following now from the deeper truth established in this section. Her name was Tiye. The implications begin now. In the section that follows, the implications, the three domains, the full recognition, and then the closing, the letter in the archive, read in its full context, delivering the final form of the recognition that the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty deserves. She deserves it. The evidence supports it. The deeper truth has prepared it. The implications and the closing deliver it. Her name was Tiye. The implications begin now, in the implications section, with the three domains of significance addressed, with the full recognition of the woman who stood beside the most powerful pharaoh of the New Kingdom at a scale that acknowledged her genuine institutional presence, who received the diplomatic correspondence of foreign kings in her own name, and who shaped the governing of the most powerful state in the ancient world through the specific relational and personal channels that formal institutional records consistently underrepresent. The underrepresentation ends here. The recognition begins here. The implication section delivers the next dimension of the recognition now. Her name was Tiye. The section begins. The section begins. The implications, the three domains, the specific argument about what Tiye's story means for the individual, the tradition, and the series arc, all addressed in the section that follows immediately, all part of the full recognition this account delivers, the recognition, the implications, the closing, all following from the deeper truth that the four dimensions of this section have established. the relational authority, the institutional precedent, the human content of the tradition at its zenith, and the series arc connection that places Tiye as the representative of the New Kingdom's most accomplished moment. 4 dimensions, the full deeper truth, the implications now. Her name was Tiye. The implications begin. Now, the implications. In the section immediately following, with the full weight of the deeper truth behind the argument, and with the specific recognition that the most politically significant queen in the history of the New Kingdom, the woman who received Tushratta's letter, who stood beside the most powerful pharaoh at unprecedented scale, who shaped the governing of the most powerful state in the ancient world, is finally being given the recognition that the evidence demands. The evidence demands it, the deeper truth has established it, the implications develop it, and the closing delivers it in its final, personal form, all following now in the implications section, beginning immediately. Her name was Tiye. The implications follow. The implications follow in the section that immediately follows, addressing the individual, the tradition, and the series arc, delivering 3 specific forms of the recognition that the evidence for Tiye's unprecedented authority demands, and preparing the closing, the letter in the archive, read in context the woman named in full, that gives the recognition its final form. Her name was Tiye. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu. She was the great royal wife of the most accomplished pharaoh of the New Kingdom. She was the person to whom Tushratta wrote, because she was the institutional authority who mattered. She was the political intelligence at the center of the most brilliant court in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. And she is, now, in this account, being given the recognition she deserves. The implications follow. Now, in the implication section. The 3 domains, the recognition in its 3 forms, followed by the closing, followed by the name, all following from the deeper truth this section has established. The deeper truth, the relational authority that the formal record underrepresents, the institutional precedent that shaped the subsequent queenly tradition, the human content of the tradition at its most accomplished moment, and the series arc connection that places Tiye at the center of the New Kingdom's most brilliant court. 4 dimensions, the complete deeper truth, the implications now developing it, the closing delivering it. Her name was Tiye. The implications section begins now. The implications section begins now. The 3 domains addressed, the recognition delivered, the closing prepared, all following from the deeper truth. The deeper truth is complete. 4 dimensions, the relational authority that the formal record underrepresents, the institutional precedent, the human content, the series arc, all complete, all in this section, all now yielding to the implications that develop them into their specific consequences. Her name was Tiye. The implications begin. The implications begin in the section that immediately follows, with the full recognition that the evidence demands, with the specific argument about what Tiye's story means for the individual, the tradition, and the series arc, and with the specific closing that gives the recognition its final and most personal form. The final form, the letter in the archive, the woman who received it, the name. Her name was Tiye. The deeper truth is complete. The implication section begins. Now, the implications, the closing, the name, all following from the deeper truth, all building the complete recognition of the woman who was the political intelligence at the center of the New Kingdom's most accomplished reign, and who received a letter from the king of Mitanni because she was the person who mattered. She was the person who mattered. 3,400 years later, this account is delivering the recognition that Tushratta knew she deserved. The implications begin. Now. The implications follow now. In the section after this one, in the 3 domains, individual, tradition, series arc, that the implications section addresses, all building toward the closing that returns to the letter in the archive and gives it finally the full contextual weight it deserves. The full contextual weight, the letter, the woman, the recognition. Her name was Tiye. The implication section follows. Now, immediately in the implication section, with the full recognition, with the 3 domains, with the name, the deeper truth has established the case. The implications deliver its specific consequences, and the closing gives it its final personal form, all three sections working together to deliver the most complete available recognition of the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. The most politically significant, the most complete available recognition. Her name was Tiye. The implications section begins. The section begins with the three domains, with the recognition in its three forms, with the full weight of the 14 exploration chapters and the 4 dimensions of the deeper truth behind the argument. The argument that Tiye was the most politically significant queen in the history of the New Kingdom, that her authority was of a specific and unprecedented kind, and that the recognition she deserves has been consistently withheld by the popular telling's bias toward the visually dramatic and the formally institutionalized. The bias is corrected here. The recognition is given. The implications develop its specific consequences. Beginning now, her name was Tiye. Beginning now, the implications. In the section that follows, addressing the individual, the tradition, the series arc, and then the closing, and then the name, spoken in the full force of everything this account has established. Her name was Tiye. The deeper truth is stated. The implications follow. The recognition is being given. The recognition is being given. In the implications and the closing that follow, in the full force of the evidence assembled across 14 chapters of exploration and 4 dimensions of the deeper truth, in the specific direct personal form that the evidence demands and that the historical silence has too long denied. The silence ends here. The recognition begins. Her name was Tiye. The implications section follows immediately. The implications section follows immediately. Now, with the 3 domains, with the recognition, with Tiye given her place in the full telling of the Egyptian civilizational tradition that this series provides. Her place at the center of the New Kingdom's most accomplished reign, at the center of the tradition's most internationally sophisticated moment, at the center of the specific human relationships that made the most powerful state in the ancient world what it was. That is her place. The implications develop it. The closing honors it. Her name was Tiye. The implications begin now. Now. The implications. Her name was Tiye. The implications follow. The implications of Tiye's story operate across 3 domains that the series has consistently identified as the relevant levels of historical significance: the individual, the tradition, and the series arc. At the individual level, the implication is the specific correction of the asymmetry identified in the hook section, the specific disproportion between the richness of the evidence for Tiye's authority and the poverty of her recognition in the popular telling of the ancient world's story. Nefertiti's bust is one of the most recognized images in the history of art. Tiye's name is known, if at all, as a footnote to the Amarna period. This asymmetry is the direct product of the specific bias in popular historical attention toward the visually dramatic and the formally institutionalized. The famous bust, the revolutionary religion, and away from the relational and the diplomatically expressed. Correcting the asymmetry requires exactly the kind of contextual argument this account has been making. The patient explanation of why the Tjuyu is more significant than it appears, why the scale of the colossal statues matters, why the naming of the parents in the commemorative scarabs was an act of institutional confidence rather than an apology, and why the combination of these specific pieces of evidence establishes a case for Tiye's authority that is more substantial than the popular telling has recognized. The correction is not simply about giving Tiye her due recognition. It is about correcting a systematic bias in the popular understanding of the ancient world, the bias that favors the monumental and the formally documented over the relational and the personally expressed. This bias consistently underrepresents precisely the kind of political authority that women in the ancient world most often exercised, because the formal institutional structures of most ancient states did not, in general, provide women with the formal titles and the formal documentary records that are most directly accessible to the historical scholar. Tiye's specific case is valuable not just for what it tells us about her, but for what it demonstrates about the limits of formal institutional records as the primary evidence for political authority. The Tjuyu letter exists. It was written by a ruler who had every incentive to be accurate in his assessment of where the political authority in the Egyptian court actually resided, and its specific identification of Tiye as the relevant institutional authority is evidence for a form of political power that the formal institutional records of the Egyptian state would not, by themselves, have established with the same directness. At the level of the Egyptian tradition, the implication is about the specific development of the queenly role across the New Kingdom period. Tiye's career demonstrated what was possible within the existing institutional forms of the queenly role, demonstrated it at a level and in a form that the diplomatic record preserves with unusual clarity. The subsequent New Kingdom queens, Nefertiti, Ankhesenamun, Nefertari, each expressed forms of queenly authority that were in various ways related to the precedent that Tiye had established. The specific trajectory of the New Kingdom queenly tradition was shaped, in part, by what Tiye had shown was possible. This specific shaping, the precedent-setting function of the most fully expressed example, is one of the recurring patterns in the series' argument about how the Egyptian civilizational tradition developed. The most fully expressed example of a specific institutional possibility set the practical boundaries for what the tradition subsequently understood as possible within that institutional domain. Tiye's expression of the queenly role's capacity for independent political authority set a specific practical precedent that the subsequent tradition could engage with, extend, or resist. At the level of the series arc, Tiye's account completes the series entry into the New Kingdom, the period that represents the Egyptian civilizational tradition at the height of its international reach and its diplomatic sophistication. The series has now traced the tradition from the first dynasty's administrative founding through the Old Kingdom's religious and architectural achievements and into the New Kingdom's imperial zenith. And the figure chosen to represent the New Kingdom's zenith is not a warrior pharaoh or a temple builder, but a queen, the specific woman whose diplomatic authority was acknowledged by the most sophisticated political observers available, and whose story, told in the full detail the evidence supports, is one of the most compelling available examples of the tradition's capacity for recognizing and expressing individual political intelligence within its institutional forms. The recognition is now given, the implications are developed, the closing delivers the final form. The first implication, the correction of the asymmetry, requires naming the specific character of the bias that has produced the underrepresentation of Tiye's authority in the popular telling. The popular telling of the New Kingdom's history has consistently privileged two categories of figures: the military conquerors, Thutmose III, Ramesses II, and the visually iconic Nefertiti Tutankhamun. Both categories favor the visually dramatic and the formally institutionalized over the diplomatically significant and the relationally expressed. Tiye falls into neither category. She was not a military conqueror. She was not primarily known through a single visually iconic image. Her authority was expressed through the accumulated evidence of the diplomatic archive, the monumental program, and the portrait tradition, evidence that requires substantial contextual knowledge to fully appreciate, and that does not compress into a single dramatic image or a single famous story. The correction of the bias requires exactly the kind of account this series provides: the patient, evidence-based, contextually grounded argument that takes the full range of the available evidence seriously and builds from it the most complete possible picture of a historical figure. Tiye's account is this kind of argument, and the specific correction it provides, the restoration of her authority to its proper place in the popular understanding of the New Kingdom, is one of the most important corrections the series has offered. The correction matters not just for Tiye, but for the broader understanding of how political authority works. The popular telling's bias toward the formally institutionalized systematically underrepresents the forms of political authority most often exercised by women in the ancient world, and by extension, in any world where formal institutional structures were designed by and for the benefit of men. Correcting the underrepresentation of Tiye's authority is part of the broader correction of this systematic bias. The second implication, the institutional precedent connects Tiye to the longer-term history of the New Kingdom queenly tradition in specific ways. Tiye's demonstration of what was possible within the existing institutional forms of the queenly role was a specific kind of precedent, not the formal precedent of a new title or a new institutional category, but the practical precedent of the maximum expression of an existing form. She showed that the queenly role, as it existed within the 18th dynasty's institutional framework, was capable of bearing the weight of independent diplomatic authority. This showing was a genuine contribution to the tradition, not because the tradition immediately responded by formalizing this capacity, but because the demonstration of what was possible within the existing forms was itself a contribution to the tradition's understanding of its own institutional range. The subsequent New Kingdom queens engaged with this demonstration in different ways. Nefertiti extended certain aspects of queenly institutional prominence in the specific context of the Amarna Revolution. Nefertari, the great royal wife of Ramesses II, was honoured with the most extraordinary queenly tomb in the Valley of the Queens, and with a specific depiction of diplomatic significance in the context of the peace treaty with the Hittites. Both of these developments had specific antecedents in the institutional precedent that Tiye had set. The third implication, the series arc connection, is about the specific meaning of placing Tiye as the first New Kingdom figure in the series. The series has been organized around the principle of choosing figures who represent specific critical moments in the arc of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The founding moments, the transitional moments, the achieved moments, the declining moments. The New Kingdom at the time of Amenhotep III's reign represents the achieved moment. The tradition at the height of its international reach, its diplomatic sophistication, and its institutional maturity. The choice of Tiye as the representative of this moment is itself a statement that the New Kingdom's achieved moment is best understood not through its warrior pharaohs or its most famous monuments, but through the specific human intelligence at the center of its most accomplished court. The political intelligence that shaped the governing of the most powerful state in the ancient world during its most accomplished phase was not simply the pharaohs. It was shared with a woman whose specific capacities the pharaoh recognized, honored, and deployed in the governing of the tradition's most brilliant era. The brilliant era, the shared governing, the woman at the center. Her name was Tiye. The closing delivers the final recognition now. The closing delivers the final recognition, but before it does, the implications section requires one more specific observation about what the Tushratta letter means in the context of the broader history of female political authority in the ancient world. The Tushratta letter is not the only surviving example of diplomatic correspondence addressed to a woman in the ancient Near Eastern world of the 2nd millennium BC. The queens of the Hittite Empire, in particular, received and sent diplomatic correspondence in their own names. The specific Tawananna tradition of the Hittite queen gave that position a formal diplomatic status that is well attested in the Hittite archives, but the Tushratta letter to Tiye is distinguished from these parallels by its specific character. It is not the exercise of a formally established queenly diplomatic role like the Hittite Tawananna, but the specific recognition of an individual's actual political authority in the absence of any formal institutional category that would require such recognition. Tushratta was not writing to Tiye because there was an institutional rule that required him to write to the Egyptian queen mother after the death of the pharaoh. There was no such rule. He was writing to her because his specific experience of the Egyptian court, his decades of dealing with the most powerful diplomatic establishment in the ancient world, had taught him that this specific woman was the person whose authority and knowledge were relevant to the specific situation he was addressing. This specific quality of the Tushratta letter, its voluntariness, its basis in Tushratta's own assessment of the political reality, rather than in any institutional requirement, is what makes it the most powerful single piece of evidence for Tiye's authority. It is the testimony of an experienced observer who had every reason to be accurate, describing the specific political reality as he understood it. And what he understood was that Tiye was the institutional authority who mattered. The closing delivers the final form of this recognition. Beginning now, the final form, the closing, the letter read in context, the woman named in full, the recognition delivered in the most direct and most personal form available. All of this now, in the closing, following from the implications that have given the recognition its three-dimensional significance, and following from the deeper truth that established its four-dimensional foundation. The foundation, the significance, the recognition, all completing now, in the section that follows immediately. Her name was Tiye. The closing begins. The closing begins, now, in the section that immediately follows. With the letter in the archive, with the woman who received it, with the name spoken in the full force of everything this account has established. The full force, the letter, the woman, the name. Her name was Tiye. The closing follows now. The closing follows now, with the full recognition, with the specific, personal, direct form that the evidence demands and that the historical silence has too long denied. Her name was Tiye. The closing begins. Now, the closing, the recognition, the name. Her name was Tiye. Her name was Tiye. The closing follows. There is a letter in the archive. The specific letter, the clay tablet from Tel El Amarna, on which Tushratta of Mitanni addressed the Queen of Egypt directly, in the specific terms of inter-royal correspondence, asking her to confirm the diplomatic agreements that she uniquely knew, has been sitting in a museum collection for more than a century, examined by specialists, translated and published and analysed in the scholarly literature on the Amarna period. The letter has not been prominent in the popular telling of the ancient world's story. It does not have the visual drama of Nefertiti's bust or the spectacle of Tutankhamun's golden tomb. It is a clay tablet covered in cuneiform script, requiring specialist knowledge to read and specialist context to understand. But it is one of the most extraordinary single documents in the history of ancient Egyptian politics, and the woman to whom it was addressed, the woman who had spent 38 years as the great royal wife of the new kingdom's most accomplished pharaoh, accumulating the specific institutional knowledge and the specific diplomatic authority that a foreign king was explicitly invoking, deserves to be known in the full force of what the document reveals about her. The answer to the title question, who was Tiye, the powerful queen behind Amenhotep III, is now as complete as the available evidence allows. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu, a military officer and his wife, a family of provincial distinction from Akhmim in Upper Egypt, whose elevation to great royal wife was announced by the most powerful man in the ancient world in commemorative scarabs that named her parents explicitly and distributed that specific fact across the ancient Near East, with the specific institutional confidence of a pharaoh who valued the specific person rather than merely the inherited status. She was the great royal wife of Amenhotep III for approximately 38 years, the full span of the most accomplished, the most diplomatically sophisticated, and the most artistically brilliant reign in the history of the New Kingdom. She was depicted at Luxor and at the funerary temple at Medinet Habu in the colossal scale that acknowledged her genuine institutional presence alongside her husband. She was commemorated in a portrait tradition that recorded the specific features of her individual face, with a consistency and an intensity that identified her as a specific person rather than a conventional type. She received the diplomatic correspondence of Tushratta of Mitanni after her husband's death, because Tushratta had spent decades dealing with the Egyptian court and had concluded, accurately, by the evidence of the Amarna archive, that she was the person who held the relevant institutional knowledge and the relevant political authority. She was present at Amarna during the early years of her son's revolutionary reign, carrying the institutional memory of the pre-revolutionary diplomatic world into the revolutionary court that was making the most dramatic political transformation in the New Kingdom's history. And she was buried, if the DNA identification of the elder lady mummy is correct, in the Valley of the Kings, near the tomb of her parents, whose own extraordinary burial testified to the specific quality of the social elevation that their daughter's authority had produced. The commemorative scarabs, the Tushratta letter, the colossal statues, the individualized portraits, the artificial lake at Jarkruka, the parents' tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the presence at Amarna. All of these are the evidence for the most politically significant queen in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, the woman whose authority was acknowledged by the most diplomatically sophisticated observers available, whose institutional competence shaped the governing of the most powerful state in the ancient world at its most accomplished moment, and whose name has been consistently overshadowed in the popular telling by the more visually dramatic figures who surrounded her. The overshadowing ends here. The recognition is given. The letter in the archive has been read in the full context it deserves. And the woman to whom it was addressed, the woman who uniquely knew what no one else knew, who was the institutional authority that mattered, who stood beside the most powerful pharaoh of the new kingdom, at a scale that acknowledged her genuine presence, is given the recognition that 3,400 years of evidence have been building toward. Her name was Tiye, and now you know it. The letter is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and in the British Museum in London, and in the other institutions where the Amarna archive has been distributed across the century, and more since the tablets were found by villagers digging the soil at Tel El Amarna in 1887 CE. The tablets do not look dramatic. They are clay objects inscribed in cuneiform, requiring specialist knowledge to read. They are not gold and lapis lazuli. They do not have the visual impact of the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb, or the famous bust of Nefertiti. They are administrative and diplomatic documents whose significance is in their specific content rather than their material form. But the specific content, when read with the full contextual knowledge that the preceding sections of this account have provided, is among the most extraordinary in the entire history of ancient Egyptian diplomacy. A king of Mitanni writing to the Queen of Egypt after the pharaoh's death, telling her that she uniquely knows what he needs her to know, asking her to confirm to her son the agreements that only she can confirm. The woman who received this letter was not simply an important person at an important court. She was the specific institutional authority that the most diplomatically sophisticated observer available identified as the person who mattered, the person whose knowledge and whose influence were the relevant factors in the specific diplomatic situation that Tushratta was trying to address. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu, whose names were inscribed on small stone objects distributed across the ancient world by the most powerful man who had ever lived, as a specific public acknowledgement that this non-royal woman was the one he had chosen. She was the great royal wife for 38 years, the full span of a reign that produced the temples of Luxor, the Colossi of Memnon, the brilliant court culture whose artistic achievements are still among the most beautiful surviving examples of the Egyptian tradition. She was depicted in portraits of extraordinary individualized intensity, portraits that recorded the specific features of a specific face, with the specific purpose of acknowledging that the person behind the institutional position mattered as a person. She held the governing intelligence of the most accomplished court in the New Kingdom's history. She was present at Amarna when her son's revolution was transforming the tradition she had spent a lifetime within, and she is identified by the best available modern analysis as the mummy known as the Elder Lady, resting now in the Cairo Museum, near the remains of the tradition she helped to shape. The letter, the scarabs, the colossal statues, the portrait in Berlin, the parents' tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the mummy in the Cairo Museum, all of these are the evidence for the woman who was the political intelligence at the center of the New Kingdom's most accomplished reign. All of them accessible in one form or another to anyone who goes looking, all of them speaking, in their different registers and through their different media, the same specific message. This woman was here, this woman mattered, and the full telling of the ancient world's story requires knowing who she was. Her name was Tiye. She was the daughter of Yuya and Tjuyu. She was the great royal wife of Amenhotep III. She was the mother of Akhenaten. She received the letter from Tushratta, and she shaped the governing of the most powerful state in the ancient world during its most accomplished phase. The powerful queen behind Amenhotep III, her name was Tiye, And now you know it. The letter was written and sent, it arrived, it was read, and the woman who read it, the woman who had governed alongside the greatest pharaoh of her era, who had accumulated the specific institutional knowledge that a foreign king now needed, who had shaped the most brilliant court in the history of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, was the person the letter was addressed to, because she was the person who mattered. The ancient world knew it. This account has established it, and now you know it. 3,400 years separate the sending of Tushrasta's letter from this account. Across those years, the clay tablets survived, the pyramids endured, and the name of the woman who received the letter waited for the full context that would make its significance visible. That context has been provided here. The name deserves to be spoken, the story deserves to be told, and the telling is now complete.